I emptied my life savings to save my parents' business. They toasted my stupidity while I stood in the dark. Then the bank delivered a $63 million check, and my mother whispered that they were ruined. My name is Abigail. I am 29 years old, and I am a certified public accountant. I used to believe that blood was thicker than money, but 3 weeks ago I learned that some people will drain your bank account and your soul without blinking. On the day their company was supposed to be sold, the massive payout did not go to them. It came straight to me. Before I tell you exactly how I secured that check, if you have ever been the family scapegoat, please hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from today and what time it is. I want to connect with people who understand what it feels like to be used. Let me take you back to a rainy Tuesday night when the ultimate betrayal began. It was exactly 11:45 at night. My phone vibrated heavily on my nightstand. The caller ID showed my father's name, Richard. My father never called me. He usually let my mother, Sandra, handle all the family communications. When I answered the phone, I did not hear his usual gruff, authoritative voice. I heard sobbing, deep, ragged gasping that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It terrified me. He told me I needed to come over immediately. He said they were losing everything. My family owned a regional logistics and freight company in the suburbs of Chicago. They had run it for 30 years. It was their pride, their joy, and the source of their country club lifestyle. But that night, my father sounded like a broken man. He claimed the bank was foreclosing in 48 hours. I did not pause to think. I threw on a coat over my pajamas, grabbed my car keys, and drove 20 minutes through a torrential downpour to their large colonial house. My mind raced with numbers and financial rescue strategies. As a financial professional, my instinct was to solve the puzzle. When I walked through their heavy oak front door, the scene was pure chaos. Sandra was pacing the hardwood floor of the living room, wringing her hands together. Her eyes were red and swollen. Richard sat slumped on the leather sofa, with his head buried in his hands. The air in the room felt heavy with panic. I asked them to show me the accounting books. I told them I could help them file for an extension, negotiate with the commercial lender, or find an emergency line of credit. Sandra rushed over and grabbed my hands. Her fingers were freezing cold. She looked me right in the eyes, tears streaming down her face. She said there was no time for an audit or a bank meeting. The bridge loan they had relied on had completely fallen through. They needed exactly $150,000 by Thursday morning. Without it, the bank would seize the assets, lock the doors, and fire all the employees. She cried that they would lose their house, their retirement, and their dignity. $150,000. I stood there in my wet coat, completely frozen. That was every single penny I had to my name. It was the emergency fund I had built over 7 years of grueling tax seasons. It was the down payment for the modest house I had been touring just last week. Most importantly, it included my entire retirement account. As a certified accountant, I knew exactly what it meant to liquidate a retirement fund early. It meant devastating tax penalties. It meant sacrificing years of compound interest. It went against every single principle of financial planning I had ever studied or advised my own clients to follow. It was financial suicide. But these were my parents. Growing up, I was never the favorite child. That role belonged to my younger sister, Chloe. Chloe was the beautiful one. The charming one. The one who married Brad. A man who loved expensive cars and tailored suits. My parents poured resources into Chloe's life. They paid for her lavish wedding. They helped with her mortgage. I was just the quiet, practical daughter. I paid my own way through state college. I worked late hours. I never asked for anything, standing in their living room, watching my powerful mother weep, and my stoic father crumble. A deep, vulnerable part of me thought this was my moment. This was my chance to finally prove my worth to them. I wanted to be the reliable daughter who saved the family legacy. I wanted them to look at me the way they looked at Chloe. I opened my laptop on their kitchen island. My hands shook as I logged into my banking portals. Sandra stood right behind my shoulder, her breathing erratic. I transferred all the money from my savings account first. Then I accessed my investment portfolio. The screen flashed multiple red warning signs about early withdrawal penalties and tax liabilities. I ignored my professional training. I clicked confirm. I watched my net worth drop to a few $100s in a matter of seconds. Sandra burst into fresh tears. She threw her arms around my neck and hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. She called me her absolute savior. She said she did not know what they would do without my brilliant, generous heart. She reached into a manila folder on the counter and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a promissory note. It looked incredibly basic, like something printed off a free legal website from the early 2000s. She signed her name at the bottom with a trembling hand and pushed it toward me. She promised they would pay me back every single dime with interest the second the company stabilized. She swore on her life that this was just a temporary hurdle. I took the piece of paper feeling a strange mix of terror and immense pride. I had done it. I had saved my family. But the very second the wire transfer confirmation code appeared on my laptop screen, the atmosphere in the kitchen changed. It was so abrupt it gave me whiplash. It was as if an invisible director had yelled "cut" on a movie set. Sandra stopped crying instantly. She stepped back from me, wiped her dry cheeks, and smoothed out her cashmere sweater. Her posture straightened. The frantic, trembling energy evaporated completely. Richard lifted his head from his hands, let out a long sigh, and walked over to the liquor cabinet. He poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon, not even offering me a glass of water. Neither of them looked at me with gratitude anymore. The warmth in Sandra's eyes was gone. They looked at me like I was a plumber who had just finished fixing a leaky pipe. Sandra checked the clock on the wall. She crossed her arms and told me I should probably head home. She said the storm was getting worse and I had to be at my office early the next morning. Her tone was completely normal. It was crisp, authoritative, and entirely lacking the desperation from 10 minutes prior. I stood there holding the flimsy promissory note, deeply confused. I asked my father if he wanted me to come by the logistics office the next day to help him manage the bank communication. Richard took a slow sip of his bourbon. He did not look me in the eye. He waved his hand dismissively and said it was all taken care of now. He told me not to worry my head about corporate operations. I packed up my laptop and walked out to my car in the freezing rain. The drive back to my small apartment felt entirely different than the drive there. A heavy, cold knot began to form in the pit of my stomach. My accounting brain, finally free from the emotional manipulation, started shouting at me. The math did not make sense. A commercial bank does not foreclose on a 30-year-old business overnight without months of prior legal notices. The sudden shift in their demeanor was deeply unsettling, but I forced myself to push those thoughts down. I told myself they were just exhausted from the stress. The next day at work was absolute torture. I was running on 2 hours of sleep. I drank 4 cups of coffee trying to focus on my clients' tax returns, but my mind kept drifting back to my parents. I kept checking my cell phone, expecting a text message from my mother or father, an update on the bank negotiations, a message asking how I was doing, a simple basic thank you for emptying my life savings to rescue them. My phone remained completely silent. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the silence felt deafening. I decided to call my mother. I wanted to make sure the funds had cleared the commercial holding account properly. I also wanted to suggest we get together for dinner. As a financial professional, I knew they needed a strict recovery strategy. They needed a budget. I wanted to help them restructure their debt so they could eventually pay me back. The phone rang 4 times before Sandra answered. She sounded annoyed, as if I had interrupted her during a spa treatment. I asked her how the meeting with the lender went. She gave a short, dismissive laugh. She said everything was perfectly fine, and the bank was completely satisfied. I breathed a sigh of relief. I asked her what time I should come over to the house for dinner so we could map out the financial plan moving forward. There was a heavy, chilling silence on the line. When Sandra finally spoke, her voice was dripping with condescension. She told me they were not having dinner at the house. She said they were heading to the country club for a special dinner reservation. I smiled, assuming this was a celebration of surviving the crisis. I asked what time the reservation was and if I needed to dress up. Sandra sighed loudly into the receiver. The sound was sharp and incredibly cruel. She said, "Abigail, this is just a company matter. It is a private dinner for the core executives." I sat completely frozen at my desk. My hand gripped the phone tightly. I reminded her that I was the one who just funded the company's survival 12 hours ago. My mother lowered her voice, speaking to me as if I were a slow, irritating child. She said, "You really would not understand the logistics side of the business anyway. You are just a number cruncher. There is absolutely no need for you to be there. We will call you in a few weeks when things settle down. Have a good night." She hung up. The line went dead. I stared at my phone screen as it faded to black. I had given them my present, my future, and my security. I had sacrificed my dream of owning a home. I had taken on massive tax penalties. I had done it all out of absolute blind love and trust. And less than 24 hours later, I was not even worthy of a seat at the dinner table. I did not cry. Something inside me, the desperate daughter who had always begged for their scraps of affection, simply shut down. The cold knot in my stomach turned into a hard block of pure ice. My parents were hiding something. The tears, the panic, the dramatic midnight begging. It was all a performance. And I was going to find out exactly what they were celebrating at that country club. I sat in my apartment for an hour after my mother hung up on me. The silence in my small living room felt suffocating. I tried to convince myself that Sandra was just acting out of stress. Business owners facing foreclosure carry a heavy burden, and perhaps she was just projecting that anxiety onto me. I needed to focus on facts, not feelings. That is what a good accountant does. I reached for my purse to grab my notepad, planning to draft a recovery budget for them, but my hand met empty space. Then I remembered. I had draped my navy trench coat over the patio chair in their backyard the previous night when I stepped outside to catch my breath during the chaos. My house keys and my primary work notebook were still in the pockets. I had to go back. The storm from the previous night had cleared, leaving the Chicago suburban streets slick and gleaming under the streetlights. The drive took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. With every mile that passed, the uneasy feeling in my gut grew heavier. I thought about my bank accounts completely drained. I thought about the house I had been saving for a dream now deferred indefinitely, but I pushed the resentment aside. They were my family. They were in trouble. Surely they appreciated what I had done, even if they were too overwhelmed to show it right now. When I turned onto their tree-lined street, the neighborhood was completely quiet. These were multi-million-dollar homes with manicured lawns and sweeping driveways. My parents had lived here for 2 decades. As I approached their property, I decided to park a few houses down. I did not want my headlights to sweep across their dining room windows and interrupt their private executive meeting. I figured I would just slip through the side gate, grab my coat from the patio, and leave without bothering them. The night air was crisp and sharply cold. As I walked up the sidewalk toward their property, I noticed the vehicles parked in the sprawling circular driveway. There was my father's sleek luxury sedan, perfectly polished. Next to it sat my mother's premium crossover, and parked diagonally, taking up the best spot near the front door, was a pristine jet-black Range Rover. I stopped dead in my tracks. I knew that car. It belonged to Brad, my arrogant brother-in-law. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. Sandra had explicitly told me over the phone that they were at the country club for a highly confidential meeting with their core executives. She had insisted that it was purely a business matter far too complex for a mere number cruncher like me to understand. Yet here was Brad's vehicle. Brad was not an executive at the logistics company. He was a high-end real estate broker who spent more time on the golf course than in an office. He had absolutely nothing to do with corporate operations or commercial lending. If Brad was here, then my golden child sister Chloe was undoubtedly here too. They were not at the country club negotiating with bankers. They were right here at home having a family gathering. A family gathering they had specifically lied to keep me away from. The cold knot in my stomach tightened into a hard, heavy stone. I stepped off the pavement and onto the damp grass, making my way silently toward the tall wooden fence that secured their backyard. The gate was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, wincing at the faint squeak of the metal hinges, and stepped into the shadowy side yard. The backyard of my parents' estate was a sprawling, beautifully landscaped oasis. They had a massive stone patio, a built-in outdoor kitchen, and string lights weaving through the branches of the old oak trees. As I crept closer to the edge of the house, staying hidden in the shadows of the tall rhododendron bushes, the warm glow of the patio lights illuminated the scene before me. I expected to see a family in mourning. I expected to see my father, with his head in his hands, stressed about payroll and bank audits. I expected to see my mother pacing nervously, calculating their remaining assets. Instead, I saw a celebration, The outdoor fireplace was blazing, casting a cheerful, dancing light across their faces. A spread of expensive catered food covered the patio table. Artisan cheeses, cured meats, and what looked like a massive seafood platter. There were no financial documents in sight. There were no calculators or printed bank statements. My father was leaning against the stone counter of the outdoor grill, laughing loudly at something Brad was saying. Richard did not look like a broken man facing imminent foreclosure. He looked triumphant. His face was flushed with joy, completely relaxed and carefree. Brad stood next to him wearing a tailored designer sweater, holding a premium cigar in one hand and a crystal flute in the other. He looked incredibly smug, carrying himself with that familiar, insufferable arrogance. Sitting on the plush patio sofa was my sister Chloe. She was glowing, wearing a brand new silk dress that easily cost more than my monthly car payment. She was scrolling through her phone and smiling, occasionally looking up to add a comment to the conversation. And standing in the center of them all was my mother Sandra. She held a heavy, dark green bottle in her hands. Even from a distance, I recognized the gold label. It was vintage Dom Perignon champagne. You do not pop open a $500 bottle of champagne the night before your 30-year-old business is supposedly seized by creditors. I stood frozen in the wet grass, my breath catching in my throat. I could not feel the cold seeping through my thin shoes. I could only feel a sudden, violent rushing in my ears. The scene in front of me defied all logic. Just 24 hours ago, these people had been weeping in terror, begging me for my life savings, to save them from total ruin. Now they were feasting and drinking the finest champagne money could buy. I moved slightly closer, pressing my back against the cold brick wall of the house, staying just outside the pool of light. I needed to hear what they were saying. I needed to understand the terrible puzzle unfolding before my eyes. Sandra finished pouring the golden liquid into 4 crystal flutes. She handed one to Chloe, one to Brad, and one to Richard before raising her own glass high in the air. Her voice carried clearly through the crisp night air. It was bright, melodic, and completely devoid of the desperation she had weaponized against me the night before. "All right, everyone, gather around," Sandra announced, a wide, victorious smile stretching across her face. "I want to propose a toast." Brad stepped forward, chuckling as he raised his glass. To surviving the great tax scare of 2026, he joked, taking a sip. Sandra shook her head, her smile turning sharp and predatory. "No, Brad. We need to raise a glass to our compliant, practical fool of a daughter." My heart stopped. The world around me seemed to tilt on its axis. To Abigail, Sandra continued, her tone dripping with absolute mockery. "We really have to give her credit. She is so utterly desperate for a little pat on the head that she did not even ask to see a single official bank document. Thanks to her pathetic need to be the family savior and her $150,000, we have officially wiped your personal tax debt completely clean, Brad. The IRS liens are gone." Chloe giggled from the sofa, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. "I still cannot believe she actually drained her retirement accounts," Chloe said, her voice laced with cruel amusement. "She is literally a CPA. She should know better. But she has always been the dumb one when it comes to reading the room." Richard laughed, a deep, booming sound that felt like a physical blow to my chest. He clinked his glass against Brad's. "Hey, it worked perfectly," my father said. "You have to admit, Sandra's tears were incredibly convincing. I almost believed we were going bankrupt myself." Sandra took a sip of her champagne and sighed with deep satisfaction. "That is the beauty of Abigail," she said smoothly. "You just play on her insecurities and she opens her wallet. And now that Brad's financial record is completely clear, there are no more liabilities dragging down the corporate audit." She paused, looking around at her favorite people in the world, her real family. "Apex Global finalized the paperwork this afternoon," Sandra announced, her voice rising in triumph. "They are going to officially buy our company next week. We are signing the closing documents on Friday." Brad let out a loud whoop of excitement. Chloe jumped up from the sofa and hugged my mother tightly. "What about the money she gave you?" Brad asked, casually swirling his champagne. "Will she try to sue for it once the sale goes public and she sees the payout?" Sandra waved her hand dismissively, the exact same gesture she had used when I was a child, asking for a fraction of her attention. "Let her try." My mother scoffed. She signed that worthless generic promissory note I printed off the internet. It was completely unnotarized and deliberately vague. By the time she realizes what happened, the corporate entity she lent the money to will be completely dissolved and absorbed by Apex Global. We will walk away with our massive payout, and she will be stuck holding a meaningless piece of paper. It is perfectly legal, and honestly, she deserves it for being so gullible. They all raised their glasses. The sharp, clear sound of crystal clinking together echoed through the quiet backyard. They drank to my financial ruin. They drank to my stupidity. They drank to their own brilliant, calculated cruelty. I stood in the darkness, gripping the rough brick wall behind me. Every single thing I had ever believed about my family shattered in that exact moment. The desperate late-night phone call had been a carefully orchestrated performance. The impending bank foreclosure had been a complete fabrication. They were never losing the company. They were never in danger of going homeless. The truth was infinitely more sinister. Brad, the golden son-in-law, had clearly accumulated a massive secret tax debt. Because he was officially listed as a minor partner or shareholder in their logistics company, his massive personal IRS liens were preventing the lucrative corporate sale to Apex Global. Apex would never acquire a company with a partner facing severe federal tax fraud or heavy liens. My parents needed to clear Brad's debt immediately to push the corporate sale through, but instead of using their own vast wealth to save their precious son-in-law, they decided to extract the money from me. They targeted me because they knew I was frugal, responsible, and desperate for their love. They staged a theatrical bankruptcy crisis, stole my entire life savings and my future to pay off Brad's mess, and now they were preparing to cash in on a massive corporate buyout while leaving me absolutely penniless. They did not just view me as a bad investment or a spare child. They viewed me as prey. I waited for the tears to come. I waited for the familiar crushing wave of grief that usually hit me whenever my mother dismissed me or my sister mocked me. I waited to feel the urge to run out onto the patio, scream at them, demand my money back, and beg them to explain how they could be so evil to their own flesh and blood. But the tears did not fall. The grief did not arrive. Instead, the warm, desperate, bleeding heart of the daughter who just wanted to be loved stopped beating entirely. In its place, something cold, hard, and incredibly sharp awakened. It was the instinct of a seasoned financial auditor. I did not feel like crying. I felt a dangerous, terrifying sense of absolute clarity. They thought I was just a compliant, practical fool. They thought I was a generic number cruncher who did not understand the logistics of corporate operations. They assumed that because I had been a pushover in my personal life, I was equally weak in my professional capacity. Sandra was right about one thing. I was a certified public accountant. I dealt with fraudulent documents, hidden assets, and contract loopholes for a living. I spent 60 hours a week tearing apart complex financial structures, finding missing money, and holding corrupt executives accountable. I knew the law, I knew the tax code, and I knew exactly how corporate acquisitions functioned. They had underestimated me to a fatal degree. I looked at my navy trench coat still draped over the patio chair just a few feet away from where Brad was smoking his cigar. My keys and my notebook were still inside the pockets. I did not step forward to retrieve them. I no longer needed anything that was in that yard. I took one last look at the people laughing and celebrating under the string lights. I watched my mother pour another round of vintage champagne. I memorized the smug, arrogant smiles on their faces. I burned the image into my mind, knowing it would be the fuel I needed for what was to come. Then I turned my back on them. I walked silently across the wet grass, pushed the metal gate open, and stepped out into the dark, quiet street. The walk back to my parked car felt entirely different than the walk toward the house. My steps were measured, purposeful, and driven by a cold, calculating energy. I got into the driver's seat, started the engine, and stared at the steering wheel. They thought they had orchestrated the perfect scam. They thought they were going to sail off into the sunset with their millions, while I drowned in tax penalties and poverty. They thought the piece of paper Sandra had forced me to sign was completely worthless. But they were not accountants. They were greedy, arrogant amateurs who had just handed a loaded weapon to a financial expert. I pulled my car away from the curb and drove into the night. I was not going home to cry. I was going to my office. I was going to pull the corporate filings for their logistics company. I was going to research Apex Global. And I was going to review every single word of that so-called worthless promissory note my mother had so carelessly printed off the internet. They wanted to play a game with my livelihood. They wanted to treat my life savings like disposable income for their favorite child. Fine. We were going to play. but they were about to learn a very painful lesson about corporate finance. When you invite an auditor to the table, they do not just check the math. They take the whole house down. The morning after this backyard discovery, I did not wake up feeling like a victim. I woke up feeling like a predator who had just caught the scent of blood. I had not slept a single minute. Instead, I had spent the entire night sitting at my small kitchen table, drinking black coffee and staring at the digital reflection of my drained bank accounts. $150,000 gone. 7 years of brutal tax seasons, missed holidays, and skipped vacations completely wiped out in a matter of seconds. But the agonizing grief that had threatened to consume me on that dark suburban street was entirely gone. It had been replaced by a cold, calculating fury. I arrived at my accounting firm 2 hours before anyone else. The office was quiet and dark, the only sound the low hum of the ventilation system. I turned on the lights in my personal office, locked the door behind me, and booted up my dual monitors. The sterile, structured environment of my workplace grounded me. Here, I was not Abigail, the overlooked, unloved daughter of Richard and Sandra. Here I was, a highly respected, certified public accountant. I dealt in absolute truths. Numbers do not lie. Numbers do not manipulate. Numbers do not play favorites, and they certainly do not fake tears to steal your retirement fund. I opened a secure browser window. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a fraction of a second. I was about to cross a line, but my conscience was crystal clear. When I was a 21-year-old college student desperate for my parents' approval, I had spent my entire summer vacation migrating their company's archaic paper ledgers into a modern, cloud-based enterprise resource planning software. I had done it completely free of charge. I had built their entire digital financial infrastructure from the ground up. And because my parents were notoriously cheap and incredibly lazy when it came to administrative details, I was willing to bet they had never bothered to revoke my master administrator access. I typed in the portal address for the logistics company. The login screen appeared. I entered my old administrative username and the complex, alphanumeric password I had created 8 years ago. I hit enter. A loading wheel spun for 2 agonizing seconds. Then, the main financial dashboard for my family's business populated across my screens. They had not changed my access. They were so confident in my blind, pathetic loyalty that they had never even considered I might look behind the curtain. I took a deep breath, cracked my knuckles, and went to work. I felt like a surgeon stepping up to the operating table. My first objective was to find the supposed catastrophic bank foreclosure. Richard had sobbed on the phone that the commercial lender was seizing their assets within 48 hours. Sandra had sworn they were on the brink of total annihilation. If a company of that size was truly facing imminent foreclosure, there would be a massive paper trail. There would be distressed debt markers, legal fee accruals, late payment penalties, stretching back for months, and correspondence from bank receivers. I pulled the general ledger and the accounts payable aging reports for the last 12 months. I cross-referenced their primary commercial credit lines. I stared at the screen, a sick, hollow feeling radiating through my chest. The balance sheets were pristine. Their debt-to-equity ratio was incredibly healthy. The company was flush with cash. In fact, their primary commercial mortgage had been paid ahead of schedule for the last 3 quarters. There were no late fees. There were no legal notices from creditors. The business was operating at peak efficiency, pulling in a massive profit margin. The foreclosure story was a complete fabricated illusion. They had looked me in the eyes, produced actual tears, and spun a catastrophic lie specifically engineered to exploit my deepest vulnerability. They knew my professional nightmare was financial ruin, and they had weaponized that fear perfectly. I pushed down the wave of nausea and shifted my focus. If the company was not in debt, then where exactly did my life savings go? I opened the incoming wire transfer logs for the previous 48 hours. It did not take long to find it. A deposit of exactly $150,000 originating from my personal banking institution, time-stamped at 12:14 in the morning. The money had landed in the company's secondary operating account. I tracked the digital footprint. I wanted to see every single movement of my money. The funds did not stay in the corporate account for long. Less than 3 hours after I had wired the money at exactly 3 in the morning, the entire sum was moved. But it was not transferred to a commercial lender. It was not used to pay off corporate vendors, or employee payroll, or operational taxes. The $150,000 was routed to a private holding account, and from there, it was immediately wired into an external, irrevocable trust. I ran the tax identification number associated with the receiving trust. My jaw tightened as the ownership details populated on my screen. The trust was registered under the name Bradley Harrison, my arrogant, swaggering brother-in-law, the man who had stood by the outdoor grill smoking a premium cigar and laughing at my stupidity. I dug deeper, accessing the cleared checks and outgoing wire memos attached to Brad's trust account. As an administrator on the parent company portal, I could see the linked external pathways my parents had set up to funnel money to him. What I uncovered over the next hour was so vile, so entirely disconnected from the wholesome church-going image my family projected, that I almost had to step away from my desk. Brad was not a highly successful real estate broker. He was a complete fraud. The financial records painted a picture of a man drowning in reckless, impulsive debt. I found the specific outgoing transfers that my $150,000 had funded. The largest chunk, nearly $90,000, had been wired directly to a high-stakes sports betting syndicate operating out of Nevada. The memos explicitly referenced the clearance of outstanding casino markers and personal gambling debts. Brad was a degenerate gambler, but that was not all. Another $45,000 was routed to an aggressive federal tax collection agency. Brad had apparently not paid income taxes on his meager real estate commissions in over 3 years. The IRS had placed severe liens on his personal assets, and the remaining $15,000. That went straight to a luxury auto financier. It was a massive balloon payment to prevent the repossession of the pristine jet-black Range Rover I had seen parked proudly in my parents' circular driveway the night before. The sheer scale of the deception washed over me like a bucket of ice water. My parents did not steal my money to save their legacy. They stole my money to save Brad. Chloe, their precious golden child, had married a deadbeat. Brad was a walking financial disaster who spent his days pretending to be a wealthy executive while secretly gambling away money he did not have. His massive toxic debts were an enormous liability. And because Brad was technically listed as a minority shareholder in the family logistics company, a vanity title my parents had given him as a wedding gift, his personal IRS liens were legally attached to the corporate entity. The puzzle pieces locked together with devastating clarity. As Sandra had bragged during her backyard toast, an acquisition firm called Apex Global was swooping in to buy the family company. But a massive corporate buyer like Apex would run a rigorous background check. The moment they saw heavy federal tax liens attached to a minority shareholder, the multi-million-dollar deal would immediately collapse. My parents needed $150,000 in untraceable off-the-books cash to wipe Brad's slate clean before the corporate auditors arrived. They could not use company funds because that would raise red flags during the acquisition review. They could not use their own personal savings because their assets were heavily tied up in real estate and country club memberships, so they turned to me, the reliable, practical, quiet daughter who never asked for anything and desperately wanted to belong. They literally squeezed me dry, sacrificing my entire future, my security, and my dream of owning a home purely to save face. They protected the fragile ego of their fake, successful white son-in-law so they could keep projecting the image of a flawless, wealthy American family at their Sunday church services. They bled their own daughter to cover up the pathetic sins of a man who contributed absolutely nothing to society. A deep, profound disgust rolled through my body. I felt physically ill. The level of sociopathic entitlement required to orchestrate this scam was beyond anything I had ever encountered in my professional career. They did not just lack basic parental love. They lacked basic human decency. They viewed my life savings as their rightful slush fund. I leaned back in my ergonomic office chair and stared at the glowing monitors. The sadness was completely gone now. There was no room left for heartbreak. I am a professional auditor. When I find a discrepancy, I do not cry about it. I document it. I build an airtight case, and I prepare for war. I sat forward and opened a new encrypted external hard drive. I began the systematic downloading of every single piece of evidence. I exported the general ledgers, showing the fraudulent transfer of my specific funds. I downloaded the wire receipts detailing the payments to the Nevada gambling syndicate and the federal tax authorities. I pulled the incorporation documents proving Brad's minority shareholder status and the direct conflict of interest it presented. I did not stop there. If they were hiding this, what else were they hiding? I accessed the corporate email servers. I searched for keywords related to the Apex Global acquisition, Brad's tax liens, and my name. The internal emails between Sandra Richard and Chloe were a goldmine of absolute malice. I found a thread from 2 weeks prior. Chloe had emailed my mother frantically stating that Brad's creditors were threatening to go public, which would ruin their reputation at the country club. Sandra's reply was cold and calculated. She wrote, "Do not worry about Brad's mess. Richard and I will handle it. We will just tell Abigail the bank is calling our loans. She is terrified of financial failure. If we act desperate enough, she will drain her accounts. She always wants to play the hero." I read the words again and again. She always wants to play the hero. I saved the email as a PDF. I saved the entire thread. I downloaded bank statements, balance sheets, tax returns, and corporate meeting minutes. I created an impenetrable digital vault of their greed, their fraud, and their utter contempt for me. For 3 hours, the only sound in my office was the rapid, relentless clicking of my mouse and the tapping of my keyboard. The sun began to rise over the city, casting a pale morning light through my office windows. The rest of the accounting firm started to arrive, the sounds of coffee brewing and colleagues chatting bleeding through my closed door. But I remained locked in my own world. I was building a weapon. When the download was finally complete, I ejected the encrypted hard drive and slipped it into the inside pocket of my blazer. I felt the physical weight of it against my chest. It contained the absolute destruction of my parents' carefully curated, wealthy suburban facade. They thought they had gotten away with it. They thought the generic, poorly drafted promissory note Sandra had handed me was the end of the transaction. They truly believed I would just sit quietly in my apartment, counting my pennies, and feeling proud that I had helped my family while they rode off into the sunset with a massive corporate buyout. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. They wanted to treat me like a dumb, compliant resource. They were about to find out exactly what happens when you try to con a forensic accountant. The panic they had faked in their living room to steal my money was going to be nothing compared to the very real, absolute terror they were going to feel when I was done with them. I picked up my coffee cup, took a slow sip, and opened a new document on my computer. It was time to thoroughly review that incredibly sloppy promissory note my mother had so generously provided. It was time to find the fatal flaw in their perfect crime. The silence in my office was absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic clicking of my computer mouse. I had spent the last 3 hours pulling every piece of evidence regarding my brother-in-law and his massive toxic tax debt. The encrypted hard drive resting on my mahogany desk was already heavy with the proof of their financial manipulation. But my training as a certified public accountant taught me that fraud rarely exists in a vacuum. When people are desperate enough to steal life savings from their own flesh and blood to cover up federal tax liens, there is always a much larger prize waiting at the end of the line. I just needed to find it. My eyes scanned the digital architecture of my family's corporate server. My parents ran their logistics business with a mix of old-school intimidation and shocking administrative negligence. They relied on overpriced consultants to maintain their systems, never bothering to understand the digital infrastructure themselves. I navigated away from the general ledger accounts and accessed the restricted executive depository. This was a heavily guarded section of the company intranet, theoretically accessible only to the chief executive officer and the primary legal counsel. But years ago, I had built the backdoor access protocols for this exact system, and my parents had never possessed the technical foresight to revoke my master administrative credentials. I scrolled past dozens of digital files containing standard operational data vendor contracts and routine compliance reports. It was a tedious process, but patience is the primary weapon of any seasoned auditor. I combed through nested folders looking for anomalies, then buried deep within a subfolder that was deceptively labeled as historical insurance records I found an encrypted directory. Its title was simple, unassuming, and entirely out of place. It was named simply Apex Deal. My pulse quickened. The directory was protected by a secondary password prompt. I stared at the blinking cursor. My parents were creatures of immense vanity and predictable habits. They did not understand complex cybersecurity. I typed in the name of the exclusive country club they belonged to, followed by the year they gained membership. Access denied. I paused, resting my chin on my hand. I thought about the backyard celebration I had witnessed just hours ago. I thought about the golden child sitting on the patio sofa. I typed in Chloe's middle name, followed by her birth year. The security prompt vanished and the folder opened. A massive repository of high-level legal and financial documents flooded my dual monitors. There were non-disclosure agreements, environmental impact studies, and deeply detailed employee rosters. But my eyes immediately locked onto the primary file at the top of the list. It was a massive PDF titled Master Asset Purchase Agreement and Merger Prospectus. I double-clicked the file. The document loaded, displaying the crisp modern logo of Apex Global, a massive publicly traded international supply chain conglomerate. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes rapidly absorbing the dense corporate jargon. This was not a preliminary negotiation or a casual letter of intent. This was a finalized binding contract waiting for the closing signatures. Apex Global was swooping in to absorb my family's entire regional routing network, their warehouse leases, and their client book. I scrolled past the standard indemnification clauses and liability waivers. I was looking for one specific section: the total valuation. When I finally reached Schedule A, the financial summary of the acquisition, the numbers on the screen seemed to burn themselves directly into my retinas. The final purchase price, structured as a completely liquid cash at close transaction, was exactly $63 million. I stopped breathing. The air in my office felt suddenly thin. I stared at the bold black typography on the glowing monitor. $63 million. My mind struggled to process the sheer astronomical scale of the wealth staring back at me. My parents were mere days away from receiving a staggering generational windfall. They were about to step into a stratosphere of wealth that would insulate them from any normal financial consequence for the rest of their natural lives. And yet, knowing this massive fortune was practically sitting in their bank account, they had chosen to orchestrate a theatrical, tear-soaked performance to steal $150,000 from their own daughter. They could have easily secured a short-term commercial bridge loan to cover Brad's embarrassing tax liens. They could have liquidated a fraction of their personal real estate portfolio. They could have quietly borrowed against their country club equity. But they did not want to inconvenience themselves. They did not want to risk raising a single red flag with the Apex Global auditors by taking on new institutional debt right before the closing bell. Instead, they had calculated that my desperate, pathetic need for their love made me the perfect disposable source of zero interest off-the-books cash. My life savings, my entire retirement fund, my future home, all of it represented roughly 0.25% of their impending payout. They had completely destroyed my financial stability just to grease the wheels for their $63 million payday. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. It was a level of sociopathic detachment I had never encountered even in the most corrupt corporate audits I had ever managed. But the depths of their cruelty did not end at the purchase agreement. As I continued to navigate the Apex deal folder, I opened a subdirectory labeled Post-Close Wealth Management. This section contained personal emails between my mother and a high-end luxury real estate broker based in Naples, Florida. I clicked on the most recent correspondence. Attached to the email was a breathtaking digital brochure for a sprawling, ultra-exclusive waterfront compound situated on the Gulf Coast. The asking price was listed at $12.5 million. The property was a monument to excessive wealth. It featured a massive Mediterranean-style main residence, a private deep-water dock, a resort-style infinity pool, and a sprawling detached guest house. I read through Sandra's emails to the broker. She outlined her vision for the family compound with terrifying clarity and enthusiasm. She detailed exactly how she and Richard would occupy the primary residence, finally enjoying the luxurious retirement they had earned. She wrote extensively about the detached guest house, explicitly instructing the broker to ensure it had the necessary square footage to accommodate Chloe and Brad permanently. Sandra discussed adding a specialized designer nursery for her future grandchildren. She requested modifications for a custom climate-controlled garage to house Brad's growing collection of luxury vehicles. She spent paragraphs obsessing over the specific brand of imported Italian marble she demanded for the kitchen renovations, and the precise layout of the private beach access. I sat in my silent office reading page after page of their opulent future plans, I searched the text strings. I looked for my name. I looked for a mention of a modest guest room. I looked for any tiny corner of this sprawling $63 million empire where the daughter who had saved their entire corporate acquisition might be allowed to visit for the holidays. There was nothing. Absolutely nothing. In their grand blueprint for the rest of their lives, I simply did not exist. They had drawn up the maps for their newly minted fortune, and they had completely intentionally erased me from the narrative. I was not a member of the family. I was just the disposable bridge financing that got them across the finish line. A profound, absolute coldness washed over me. It was the complete death of the naive girl who had rushed into the freezing rain to save her weeping father. But the final piece of their treacherous puzzle was still waiting to be uncovered. I needed to know exactly how they planned to handle the promissory note my mother had so tearfully signed in her kitchen. I knew they had no intention of paying me back, but I needed to see the legal mechanics of their betrayal. I found the answer inside a confidential legal memo drafted by a boutique corporate restructuring firm in downtown Chicago. The document was titled Strategic Liability Management. I opened the file and began dissecting the dense bureaucratic language. The strategy was sickeningly brilliant in its pure malice. The transaction with Apex Global was strictly structured as an asset purchase agreement, not a stock purchase. From an accounting perspective, the distinction is massive. It meant that Apex Global was only buying the valuable pieces of my parents' business. The trucks the regional warehouse leases, the lucrative client lists, and the intellectual property. Apex was deliberately leaving the original corporate entity behind. My parents' primary company would be completely gutted of all its valuable assets, leaving behind a hollow, empty shell, and sitting entirely alone inside that hollow shell would be all the unsecured liabilities. The legal memo specifically highlighted my $150,000 loan. Because Sandra had deliberately used a generic, poorly drafted promissory note printed from a free internet template, my loan was classified as completely unsecured debt. It was not tied to any physical collateral. It was not personally guaranteed by Richard or Sandra. It was simply a basic loan made directly to the corporate entity. The restructuring firm advised my parents to let the original hollowed-out company slide into a structured, deliberate bankruptcy immediately after the Apex Global acquisition funds were safely routed to their new, untouchable, offshore holding accounts. Once the empty shell filed for insolvency, unsecured creditors like me would be legally and permanently wiped out. There would be absolutely no capital left in the original business to pay me back. The court would simply dissolve the debt. If I tried to sue my parents personally to recover my life savings, their expensive, high-powered legal team would easily argue that the loan was made strictly to the defunct corporation. They would shield their new $63 million fortune behind an impenetrable corporate veil. They had orchestrated a perfectly legal, meticulously planned fake bankruptcy scheme to steal my money and leave me with absolutely zero legal recourse. I was marked as a calculated casualty of their transaction. I looked at the digital calendar displayed on the bottom corner of my monitor. The date glowed softly in the dim light of my office. I checked the official timeline outlined in the Apex Global closing documents. The final acquisition signatures and the massive wire transfers were scheduled to execute this upcoming Friday at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I had exactly 3 days. 3 days before my parents and my sister popped another bottle of vintage champagne to celebrate their incredible wealth. 3 days before they boarded a first-class flight to their new Florida compound. 3 days before the empty shell of their company formally filed for bankruptcy, legally obliterating my entire financial future forever. The ticking clock echoed in my mind, but it did not bring panic. It brought absolute razor-sharp focus. My parents had relied on my emotional vulnerability. They had banked on the assumption that I was just a quiet, obedient number cruncher who would never dare to look behind the curtain of their glamorous lives. They assumed I would be too devastated, too confused, and too intimidated by their wealth to fight back. But they had made one catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. They had handed a fraudulent, unsecured financial contract to a certified forensic accountant who specialized in corporate restructuring. I closed the Apex deal folder. I securely disconnected from the logistics company server, wiping my digital footprint from the access logs with practiced efficiency. I pulled the encrypted hard drive containing all their dirty secrets, all their fake bankruptcy plans, and all the evidence of Brad's tax fraud, and slid it safely into my briefcase. I was no longer the discarded, unloved daughter begging for a seat at the country club dining table. I was the financial executioner, and I had exactly 72 hours to rig the most spectacular, legally binding trap my family had ever seen. The race against time had begun, and I fully intended to cross the finish line first. The crisp morning air of downtown Chicago whipped against my face as I walked through the revolving glass doors of one of the most intimidating corporate law firms in the city. I was not there to weep or ask for sympathy. I was there to execute a financial strike. My briefcase felt heavy, anchoring me to the reality of what I was about to do. Inside was the encrypted hard drive containing every piece of evidence proving my parents intended to steal my life savings, hide Brad's massive tax fraud, and cash out a $63 million corporate acquisition. But more importantly, inside a clear plastic sleeve, I carried the flimsy, single-page promissory note my mother, Sandra, had forced me to sign in her kitchen. The receptionist escorted me to a corner office on the 42nd floor. The room smelled of expensive espresso and polished mahogany. Sitting behind a massive desk was Jonathan Hayes. Jonathan was a corporate litigator who specialized in hostile takeovers and complex financial restructuring. He was 55 years old, impeccably dressed, and possessed a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in the courtroom. I had met him briefly 2 years ago during a corporate audit seminar, and I knew instantly that if I ever needed to tear a company down to its studs, he was the man I would call. Jonathan stood up and offered a firm handshake. He took one look at my expression and gestured toward a heavy leather chair across from his desk. He did not ask how my weekend was. He simply asked what kind of war we were preparing for. I sat down, unzipped my briefcase, and placed the encrypted hard drive on his desk. I spoke quietly and methodically, stripping all the emotion from my voice. I explained the midnight phone call, the fake foreclosure story, and the immediate wire transfer of my entire retirement fund. I walked him through the forensic trail I had uncovered the previous night. I detailed how my money was funneled into an offshore trust to clear my brother-in-law's federal tax liens, specifically to sanitize the logistics company for an impending acquisition by Apex Global. Jonathan listened in absolute silence. He plugged the hard drive into his secure terminal and began scanning the documents I had organized. He read the internal emails between my mother and my sister, the ones where they openly mocked my desperation to be a good daughter. He reviewed the luxury real estate brochures for their planned Florida compound, noting my complete absence from their future lives. Then Jonathan opened the legal memo drafted by their boutique restructuring firm. He read the strategy detailing how they planned to strip all the valuable assets from the primary corporation, sell them to Apex Global, and purposefully drive the remaining shell company into bankruptcy to legally obliterate my unsecured loan. When he finished reading, Jonathan leaned back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. In his 30 years of corporate litigation dealing with embezzlers, corrupt executives, and hostile corporate raiders, he told me he had rarely seen a scheme so intimately and profoundly evil. The fact that my own parents had engineered a fake bankruptcy to leave me destitute while they secured a $63 million windfall deeply disgusted him. He asked me what my ultimate goal was. He offered to file an emergency injunction to freeze the Apex Global transaction. He said we could easily alert the federal authorities to Brad's tax evasion maneuvers and tie my parents up in years of grueling litigation. I shook my head. I told him I did not want to stop the sale. I wanted the sale to go through perfectly. I just did not want them to be the ones cashing the check. Jonathan looked at me with a sharp, assessing gaze. He asked me what leverage I had to hijack a finalized corporate acquisition. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the clear plastic sleeve. I slid the promissory note across the polished wood of his desk. I told him this was the contract my mother had printed from the internet to make her emotional performance look legitimate. Jonathan picked up the piece of cheap printer paper. He held it up to the light, scanning the poorly formatted paragraphs, and my mother's rushed, messy signature at the bottom. The air in the room grew completely still as his eyes darted back and forth across the dense boilerplate text. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, bracing myself for the bad news. I expected him to confirm exactly what the restructuring firm had advised my parents. I expected him to say the note was completely unsecured, terribly drafted and utterly useless in the face of a corporate bankruptcy filing. Instead, a slow, predatory smile began to spread across Jonathan's face. He read the document a second time, a low chuckle escaping his chest. He set the paper down, leaned forward, and looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated legal delight. He asked me if my mother had consulted an attorney before forcing me to sign this specific document. I told him absolutely not. Sandra was incredibly arrogant and famously cheap when it came to administrative tasks. She believed she was smarter than any lawyer. She had undoubtedly just searched for a standard business loan template on a free legal website, printed the longest one she could find so it would look intimidating, and slapped it on the kitchen counter. Jonathan shook his head in sheer disbelief. He picked up his silver pen and tapped the center of the page. He explained that my mother had not downloaded a standard generic family loan template because she was too lazy to read the fine print and too arrogant to hire a professional. She had accidentally downloaded a highly aggressive institutional-grade venture capital bridge loan contract. It was the exact type of draconian financial instrument ruthless private equity firms use when lending emergency capital to distressed startups. My heart began to beat faster against my ribs. I asked him what that meant for my money. Jonathan turned the document around so it faced me. He pointed to a dense block of text buried in the third paragraph. He told me to read Clause 4.b. I leaned forward and read the legal jargon. It outlined a strict covenant regarding financial transparency. The clause explicitly mandated that the borrowing entity must provide fully certified financial statements to the lender within exactly 30 days of the loan execution. The language was absolute. It required total disclosure of all assets, liabilities, and any pending corporate restructuring or acquisition discussions. I looked up at Jonathan, the reality of the timeline suddenly clicking into place in my mind. Jonathan nodded, his smile widening. He said the 30-day financial reporting deadline was a standard trap used by venture capitalists to ensure borrowers were not hiding massive debts. If the borrower failed to deliver those certified financial reports by the 30th day, they were immediately placed in technical and legal default. I calculated the days in my head. My parents had been so focused on finalizing the Apex Global deal and planning their lavish Florida retirement that they had completely ignored my existence. Out of sheer contempt and superiority, they had never sent me a single financial document. They had intentionally kept me in the dark, laughing at my stupidity, while they partied at the country club. And yesterday marked exactly 31 days since I had wired them my life savings. They were officially in default of the loan. But a default on an unsecured loan still seemed like a weak weapon against a planned corporate bankruptcy. I asked Jonathan how a missed reporting deadline would stop them from simply dissolving the company and leaving me with nothing. That is when Jonathan pointed to the very bottom of the page. He tapped his pen against a specific subsection titled Creditor Remedies. He told me this was the fatal flaw in my mother's perfect crime. He explained that in aggressive venture capital contracts, the penalty for defaulting on a mandatory financial disclosure is not just a demand for immediate cash repayment. Institutional lenders know that distressed companies rarely have cash on hand to pay them back, so they insert a mechanism to protect their investment. It is called a debt conversion right. Jonathan's voice grew intense, carrying the weight of a judge delivering a final verdict. He explained that because my parents had violated the 30-day financial reporting deadline, the contract legally granted me, the lender, the unilateral power to convert my outstanding $150,000 debt directly into corporate equity. I stared at the paper, the breath leaving my lungs. I asked him to clarify exactly what kind of equity. Jonathan leaned across the desk, his eyes locking onto mine. He said the template my mother had so carelessly provided allowed the creditor to convert the debt at a deeply discounted punitive valuation. Because my parents had officially triggered the default clause by hiding the Apex Global acquisition, the mathematical conversion metrics outlined in this specific document gave me the absolute legal authority to seize 100% of the company's Class A voting shares to recover my capital. The silence in the office was deafening. The sheer magnitude of what Jonathan was telling me echoed through my brain. My parents thought they had handed me a worthless piece of paper that would legally trap me in their fake bankruptcy scheme. Instead, out of pure arrogant negligence, my mother had forced me to sign a binding corporate instrument that gave me the legal right to execute a hostile takeover of their entire logistics company. I did not just have the right to ask for my $150,000 back. I had the legally enforceable right to become the sole undisputed owner of their business. And because I would legally own 100% of the voting shares, I would also be the sole recipient of the massive payout when Apex Global purchased the company. The $63 million would not go into their offshore accounts. It would go directly to me. A profound, terrifying sense of power washed over me. For 29 years, my parents had treated me like an insignificant, disposable accessory. They had belittled my career, mocked my practical nature, and prioritized a gambling fraud over my financial security. They had meticulously planned to leave me destitute and broken. But the universe, armed with a free internet legal template, and my mother's blinding hubris, had just handed me a fully loaded weapon. I looked at Jonathan, my hands completely steady. I asked him if this was a theoretical legal argument or a guaranteed strike. I needed to know if their expensive country club lawyers could fight the conversion in court and drag this out for years. Jonathan shook his head firmly. He said the beauty of a unilateral debt conversion right is that it does not require a lengthy courtroom battle if executed properly. It is a contractual mechanism. However, he warned me that there was one crucial, delicate step left to make it absolutely bulletproof. To activate the conversion and officially transfer the voting shares into my name before the Apex Global closing on Friday, I needed the current executive officers to sign a formal notice of equity conversion. My heart sank slightly. I told Jonathan my parents were greedy, but they were not entirely brain-dead. If I handed them a physical document stating that I was taking over their company, they would immediately shred it, call their lawyers, and accelerate the bankruptcy process to destroy me before the transfer could be finalized. They would never willingly hand over the keys to a $63 million empire. Jonathan's predatory smile returned. He leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers together. He agreed that they would never sign a physical piece of paper if they knew what it was. He said we had to use their own arrogance against them. He pointed out that my parents were currently drowning in mountains of administrative paperwork required for the Apex Global merger. They were dealing with environmental disclosures, employee liability waivers, and tax indemnification forms. As I had experienced firsthand, they hated reading legal documents. They viewed administrative work as beneath them, a tedious chore meant for secretaries and accountants. Jonathan suggested we simply bury the final trap inside the noise of their own greed. We would draft the formal notice of equity conversion. We would format it to look exactly like a routine, highly technical tax compliance document required by the Apex Global auditors. And we would deliver it to them in a way that guaranteed they would sign it blindly driven by their desperate rush to finalize their massive payday. I sat in the heavy leather chair looking out the 42nd floor window at the sprawling city of Chicago below. The plan was terrifyingly brilliant. It was dangerous, incredibly precise, and poetic in its justice. My parents had used a document they did not understand to steal my life savings. Now I was going to use a document they refused to read to legally strip them of everything they owned. I turned back to Jonathan, my posture perfectly straight, my voice devoid of any hesitation. I told him to draft the conversion papers immediately. I knew exactly how to make them sign it without a second thought. The transition from being a discarded daughter to a corporate predator did not happen overnight. It happened in the quiet space of a Tuesday morning commute, driving back to my accounting firm from Jonathan's downtown Chicago office. The city moved around me in a blur of gray concrete and yellow taxicabs, but my mind was completely still. I now possessed the legal mechanism to seize 100% of my parents' logistics company. The only obstacle remaining was their signature. I needed the very people who had deliberately plotted my financial ruin to willingly sign the instrument of their own destruction. I knew my family. I knew their blinding arrogance, their profound laziness, and their absolute disdain for the tedious mechanics of the business they owned. They loved the country club dinners and the luxury cars, but they despised the actual work of running a corporation. I had to weaponize that exact laziness. The opportunity presented itself much sooner than I anticipated. I had barely stepped off the elevator and unlocked my office door when my cell phone began to vibrate across my desk. The screen flashed with a picture of my mother, Sandra. I let it ring 3 times. I took a deep breath, smoothing my expression into a mask of pure submission, and answered the call. Before I could even offer a greeting, Sandra launched into a frantic, demanding tirade. Her voice was sharp and clipped entirely. lacking the fake weeping desperation she had used to steal my life savings just a few days prior. She complained that the acquisition auditors from Apex Global were becoming incredibly difficult. They were demanding 5 years of fully reconciled tax schedules, perfectly updated depreciation logs, and a complete audit of all minority shareholder equity transfers. She let out an exaggerated sigh of sheer annoyance. She said the corporate lawyers they had hired were charging $1,000 an hour and taking entirely too long to process the raw data. She told me the Apex Global executives wanted the entire tax portfolio verified and signed off by a certified public accountant before the closing ceremony on Friday. Then came the insult delivered with the casual cruelty she had perfected over 29 years. She said I needed to come over and pick up the banker's boxes of raw receipts immediately. She told me this was a chance for me to finally be useful to real business people, instead of just shuffling papers for small-time clients at my little accounting firm. She demanded I spend my entire weekend organizing, reconciling, and digitizing the backlog of their corporate tax files. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my voice remained perfectly small and compliant. I played the role she expected. I played the desperate, obedient fool. I told her I would be happy to help. I asked if there was any specific format the Apex Global auditors preferred. I kept my tone eager, as if I were absolutely thrilled to be included in their prestigious corporate affairs. Sandra let out a short, dismissive laugh. She said she did not care about the formatting as long as it looked professional enough to pass the final review. She instructed me to bundle all the finalized tax schedules, the liability waivers, and the shareholder equity clearances into one massive digital document file. She said Richard, Chloe, and Brad were far too busy finalizing the country club catering for the closing party to deal with tedious paperwork. She explicitly ordered me to set up a DocuSign packet and email it to them so they could just click through it from their phones while they attended a wine tasting event on Saturday afternoon. I closed my eyes and smiled. It was almost too easy. They were literally handing me the shovel and asking me to dig their graves. I assured her the digital packet would be in her inbox by Saturday morning. She hung up without saying thank you. For the next 4 days, I did not leave my office. I consumed terrible takeout coffee and worked until my vision blurred. I genuinely completed the tax reconciliations they had demanded. I built the depreciation schedules. I organized the chaotic mess of their corporate ledgers. I needed the bulk of the digital packet to be absolutely flawless, legitimate accounting work. It had to look incredibly boring, deeply technical, and overwhelmingly massive. By Friday night, I had compiled a digital document that was exactly 412 pages long. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic exhaustion. But the true genius of the packet was not the tax schedules. It was the trap Jonathan and I had meticulously constructed and buried deep within the digital pages. Jonathan had drafted the formal notice of equity conversion perfectly. He had formatted it to mirror the exact typography, margin spacing, and legal jargon of a standard Internal Revenue Service Section 338 corporate realignment form. To the untrained eye, it looked like just another deeply confusing tax addendum required for a corporate buyout. The title of the document was dense and remarkably uninteresting. It read Auxiliary Schedule C Shareholder Equity Realignment and Unsecured Debt Capitalization Consent. It was buried precisely on page 287 of the 412-page packet. We had positioned it immediately following a 70-page section detailing warehouse depreciation metrics, which is arguably the most mind-numbing financial reading in existence. By the time my parents reached page 287, they would be suffering from severe signature fatigue. The psychological mechanics of digital signature software are incredibly predictable. When a person is confronted with a massive digital contract, especially one filled with dense financial tables, they stop reading after the 5th page. They rely on the software to guide them. They simply scroll down and click the bright yellow button that says Sign Here. They do not read the fine print. They just want the task to be over, and my parents wanted nothing more than to rush through the boring paperwork so they could get back to planning their luxurious Florida retirement. On Saturday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, I uploaded the massive PDF file into the DocuSign portal. I assigned the mandatory signature fields. I placed a signature tag for Richard as the Chief Executive Officer. I placed a signature tag for Sandra as the primary corporate secretary. And I placed a signature tag for Chloe who technically held a seat on the board of directors, I added a short, highly professional email message. I wrote that these were the final reconciled tax schedules and equity clearances required by Apex Global. I noted that their immediate electronic signatures were required on all highlighted pages to ensure the corporate sale proceeded without delay on Friday. I took a long, steady breath. I hovered my mouse over the send button. This was the point of no return. Once I clicked send, I was officially declaring war on my own blood. I thought about the $150,000 they had stolen from me. I thought about the fake tears Sandra had cried in her living room. I thought about the backyard toast where they had clinked their champagne glasses and celebrated my financial ruin. I clicked send. The digital packet flew through the servers, landing directly in the inboxes of the 3 people who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. The waiting was pure agony. I sat at my desk staring at the tracking dashboard on my monitor. The software provided real-time updates showing exactly when a recipient opened the document and when they completed their assigned signatures. Hours passed. The morning sun climbed higher over the Chicago skyline. I paced the length of my office. I drank another cup of coffee. I reviewed the legal codes Jonathan had provided, ensuring our strategy was absolutely airtight. At exactly 1:15 in the afternoon, my computer chimed. A small notification window popped up in the corner of my screen. Richard Myers has viewed the document. My heart leapt into my throat. I stopped pacing and leaned over my desk, my eyes glued to the screen. I pictured my father sitting at a table at the country club, probably annoyed that he had to put his drink down to look at his phone. A minute later, another notification appeared. Sandra Myers has viewed the document. They were looking at it together. I imagined Sandra leaning over Richard's shoulder, complaining about the sheer length of the file. I could almost hear her voice dismissing the 400 pages of meticulous accounting work as a simple secretarial task. The digital tracker showed their progress. It took them less than 3 minutes to scroll through the first 100 pages. They were not reading a single word. They were just hunting for the yellow signature boxes. At 1:22, the system chimed again. Richard Myers has completed signing. I let out a shaky breath. My father had signed the document. He had legally consented to the conversion. He had just signed away the company he had built over 30 years, completely blinded by the promise of a $63 million payout. But I still needed Sandra and Chloe to finalize the trap. The corporate bylaws required a majority board consent for any major equity realignment. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The silence in my office felt thick and suffocating. Why had Sandra not completed her portion? Had she stopped to read? Had she noticed the discrepancy on page 287? Had she realized that the Auxiliary Schedule C was not a tax form, but a full surrender of their voting shares? Doubt began to creep into my mind. I reached for my phone, wondering if I should call them and play the panicked accountant, urging them to finish the paperwork before the bank closed. But I forced my hand away. I could not break character. I had to let their own greed guide them. At 1:48, the computer chimed twice in rapid succession. Sandra Myers has completed signing. Chloe Myers has viewed the document. I gripped the edge of my mahogany desk. 2 down, 1 to go. Chloe was the wild card. She was deeply vain and mostly completely uninterested in corporate affairs, but she was unpredictable. She was likely sitting next to my mother, sipping a mimosa and complaining about having to use her thumb to sign a digital screen. The tracker showed Chloe jumping rapidly through the document. She did not even pause. She moved from page to page with reckless speed. At 1:51, a loud, triumphant alert echoed through my office speakers. A green checkmark appeared on the main dashboard. The text below it was the most beautiful sentence I had ever read in my entire professional career. Completed. Apex Global Pre-Acquisition Tax, Disclosures, and Schedules. I stared at the green checkmark for a full minute, making absolutely sure it was not an illusion. Then, with trembling fingers, I clicked the download button. I saved the finalized, fully executed PDF to my secure server. I opened the document and scrolled directly to page 287. There they were. 3 perfectly rendered digital signatures stamped directly beneath the notice of equity conversion. Under the strict legal parameters of the venture capital promissory note, and validated by the executed signatures of the chief executive officer, the corporate secretary, and the board director. My $150,000 unsecured debt had just been fully capitalized. I had unilaterally exercised my legal right to convert the defaulted loan. By signing that specific page, Richard, Sandra, and Chloe had legally surrendered 100% of the Class A voting shares of the logistics company directly to me. The shadow takeover was complete. I was no longer the discarded, overlooked, spare child. I was no longer the dumb, compliant accountant who could be manipulated into emptying her retirement fund. I was now the sole undisputed legal owner of a massive corporate enterprise. And because I owned the company, I also owned the rights to the pending acquisition. The $63 million purchase agreement with Apex Global, the staggering generational wealth my parents had planned to use to build their sprawling Florida compound and buy luxury cars, now belonged entirely to me. They had absolutely no idea. They were currently sitting at a country club, probably toasting to their brilliant deception, entirely unaware that they had just given away their entire empire for the price of a fake bankruptcy scheme. They thought they had successfully ruined my life. They did not know that with a few careless clicks on a smartphone screen, they had just handed me the keys to their kingdom. I printed a hard copy of the fully executed document. I placed it carefully inside a pristine manila folder. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace settle over my shoulders. The frantic desperation that had plagued me since that rainy Tuesday night was gone. The cold, heavy stone in my stomach had dissolved into a warm, radiant hum of absolute power. I picked up my cell phone and dialed Jonathan's direct line. He answered on the first ring. I told him the execution was complete, the signatures were verified, and the cryptographic hash was logged. I told him we officially owned the company. I could hear the sharp intake of breath on his end of the line, followed by a low, approving chuckle. He told me to forward the certified document to his secure server immediately. He said he would draft the internal ownership transfer notices and prepare the final legal filings for the state registry. He asked me what the next step in my strategy was. He wanted to know if we should notify Apex Global of the ownership change before the closing ceremony. I looked out the window at the bustling city below. I thought about the extravagant closing party my parents had planned for Friday. I thought about the expensive suits, the catered food, and the smug, arrogant smiles they would wear as they prepared to accept a massive check they no longer owned. I told Jonathan we were not going to tell anyone anything. We were going to let the corporate acquisition proceed exactly as planned. We were going to let my parents walk into that country club ballroom feeling like untouchable billionaires. We were going to let them taste the absolute pinnacle of their greed. And then, in front of the executives, the bankers, and every single person they were trying to impress, we were going to drop the hammer. I hung up the phone, packed the manila folder into my briefcase, and walked out of my office. I had a closing party to attend, and I needed to find the perfect dress for a corporate execution. The ink on the digital transfer documents was barely dry, but the atmosphere within my family had already undergone a toxic radioactive mutation. By Tuesday morning, just 3 days before the Apex Global closing ceremony, a suffocating cloud of sheer arrogance had descended upon my parents and my sister. They no longer walked, they strutted. They no longer spoke, they proclaimed. They were completely intoxicated by the illusion of their impending wealth, operating under the dangerous assumption that the $63 million acquisition was an absolute certainty. They were so blinded by their own greed that they committed the ultimate cardinal sin of corporate finance. They began spending the money before the check had actually cleared the bank. Brad, my perpetually arrogant brother-in-law, simply could not wait until Friday to start living like a freshly minted tycoon. With his personal tax liens secretly wiped clean by my stolen life savings, his credit profile had been temporarily resurrected. He immediately leveraged the finalized pending status of the Apex Global merger prospectus to secure a massive, high-interest financial instrument known as a bridge loan. As a certified public accountant, the mere concept of the specific loan Brad orchestrated made my blood run cold. A bridge loan is a short-term, incredibly expensive financing option used by aggressive buyers to purchase real estate immediately with the explicit promise that incoming capital will pay off the debt within a few weeks. The interest rates are astronomical, and the penalties for defaulting are absolute financial devastation. But Brad did not care about interest rates. He only cared about status. Using the bridge loan heavily collateralized by the promised payout from my parents' logistics company, Brad and Chloe officially closed on a sprawling $5 million estate in the ultra-exclusive northern suburbs of Chicago. It was a monstrous 10,000-square-foot stone mansion featuring a sweeping double staircase, a customized wine cellar, and a manicured lawn that rivaled a professional golf course. I knew all the details of the property because Sandra had spent the entire week loudly boasting about it to anyone who would listen. They had not just bought the house. They had immediately commissioned a premium interior design firm, paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in non-refundable retainers to have custom Italian furniture imported and installed by the weekend. They were leasing brand new luxury vehicles to match the aesthetic of their new cobblestone driveway. They were burning through millions of dollars in borrowed cash, happily signing personal guarantees and putting their names on legally binding promissory notes, completely convinced that Friday's corporate buyout would effortlessly cover their massive spending spree. They were standing on a financial trapdoor, tying the noose around their own necks, and smiling while they did it. I watched this spectacular display of financial suicide unfold from a distance, maintaining my carefully constructed mask of the dutiful, obedient daughter. I did not offer a single word of warning. I did not advise them on the catastrophic risks of uncollateralized bridge loans. I simply watched the structural supports of their lives rot away, knowing that I held the only key to the demolition switch. The true depth of their delusion was put on full public display that Wednesday evening. Our suburban community church was hosting its annual summer fellowship barbecue. It was a long-standing tradition, a sprawling outdoor event held on the immaculate green lawns behind the sanctuary. Dozens of folding tables were draped in checkered cloths, heavy with potato salad, grilled corn, and sweet tea. It was the kind of tight-knit, heavily judgmental social environment where reputations were treated as the highest form of currency. My parents treated the church barbecue like their own personal coronation ceremony. When I arrived at the church grounds, parking my modest sedan far away from the flashing chrome of Brad's luxury SUV, I immediately spotted my family holding court near the center of the lawn. Sandra was dressed in a pristine white linen outfit that looked entirely out of place for a casual barbecue. She was surrounded by the church elders, the pastor, and several affluent neighbors, practically glowing under the warmth of their attention. I stood near the refreshment table, pouring myself a plastic cup of iced tea, and watched the performance. Sandra was passing her smartphone around the circle of admiring congregants, showing off high-resolution photos of Chloe and Brad's new $5 million estate. Her voice carried over the sound of the acoustic worship music playing through the outdoor speakers. "The Lord has truly blessed our family's hard work," Sandra announced, pressing a hand to her chest in a display of practiced humility. "Richard and I have always believed that if you pour your heart into your business and stay faithful, the rewards will manifest. We are just so incredibly thrilled to see Chloe and Brad stepping into this new, beautiful season of prosperity. It takes real vision to secure a property like that." The pastor nodded approvingly, offering a warm smile. "You have raised a wonderful family, Sandra. It is a testament to your guidance." My stomach churned at the sheer hypocrisy. There was absolutely no mention of the daughter who had worked 60-hour weeks to build the digital infrastructure of their company. There was no mention of the $150,000 they had emotionally extorted from me just days prior to save their precious son-in-law from a federal tax indictment. In the gospel, according to Sandra, their sudden astronomical wealth was simply the righteous reward for their superior moral character. I took a slow sip of my iced tea. The ice cubes clinked softly against the thin plastic. Then I saw Chloe walking toward me. My sister looked like she had just stepped out of a luxury lifestyle magazine. She was wearing a designer sundress, oversized sunglasses pushed up into her perfectly styled blonde hair, and carrying a leather handbag that easily cost 3 months of my rent. She moved with a newly acquired swagger, the distinct, heavy confidence of a woman who genuinely believed she was untouchable. She stopped in front of me, looking me up and down with a slow, sweeping gaze. Her eyes lingered on my plain cotton blouse and practical flats. The corners of her mouth twitched into a smirk that was entirely devoid of any sisterly affection. "You look exhausted, Abigail," Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "Are you still working those crazy overtime hours at that little accounting firm?" I held her gaze perfectly steady. "I am keeping busy," I replied, my tone mild and unbothered. "Tax season is always demanding." Chloe sighed, shaking her head as if my entire existence was a tragic disappointment. I just do not understand how you can stand it. Sitting in a gray cubicle all day crunching numbers for other people's money. You are so complacent. You really need to start thinking bigger. She reached out and adjusted the strap of her expensive handbag, making sure the designer logo caught the evening sunlight. Look at Brad, she continued, leaning in, slightly lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was meant to be deeply condescending. He just secured the financing for our new estate in Lake Forest. $5 million, Abigail. It takes a certain kind of aggressive high-level financial intelligence to pull off a move like that. You have to be willing to take risks. You have to have a mind for acquisitions. That is just not something you are ever going to learn by playing it safe and staring at spreadsheets. I stood there on the manicured church lawn, surrounded by the smell of hickory smoke and the sound of laughing children, and stared at my younger sister. The absolute breathtaking irony of her words washed over me like a physical wave. She was calling me complacent. She was calling me incompetent at making money. She was standing there boasting about her husband's aggressive financial intelligence, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was a degenerate gambling addict whose massive tax liabilities had almost derailed their entire future. Even worse, she was mocking my accounting career while standing completely naked in the crosshairs of the most devastating financial trap I had ever built. She thought I lacked vision. She had no idea that my vision had already systematically dismantled her entire life. She did not know that the massive bridge loan Brad had just signed, the loan that was currently funding her designer dress and her $5 million mansion, was entirely dependent on the Apex Global payout. And she certainly did not know that because she had lazily clicked through a digital document without reading it. That entire payout now belonged exclusively to the sister she was currently insulting. Chloe and Brad were spending money that legally belonged to me. They were chaining themselves to millions of dollars in high-interest debt, borrowing against a fortune they had just surrendered. When Friday arrived and the bank routed the $63 million into my personal accounts, Chloe and Brad would be left holding a $5 million mortgage they could never possibly repay. I looked at her smug, radiant face. I felt no urge to defend my career. I felt no desire to explain the complexities of corporate equity transfers or the legal ramifications of unilateral debt conversion rights. Defending myself to Chloe would be like trying to explain chess to a pigeon. The pigeon is just going to knock over the pieces, soil the board, and strut around claiming victory. I let her have her moment. I let her feel incredibly, vastly superior. You might be right, Chloe, I said, offering a small, perfectly pleasant smile. High-level acquisitions are definitely a different kind of game. It takes a very specific kind of vision to see how the pieces fit together. Chloe beamed, completely missing the loaded truth beneath my words. Exactly, she said, patting my arm patronizingly. Maybe Brad can sit down with you sometime and give you some advice on wealth management. Once we get settled into the new estate, of course. We are going to be incredibly busy dealing with the interior designers this week. That sounds wonderful, I replied softly. Good luck with the closing on Friday. Oh, we do not need luck, Chloe laughed, tossing her hair. We have strategy. She turned and walked back across the lawn to rejoin our mother's circle of admirers. I watched her go, sipping my sweet tea. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the church grounds. I stood alone by the refreshment table, a quiet, unseen observer in my own family's narrative. I was the generic number cruncher. I was the compliant fool. I was the disposable sister. Let them feast. Let them celebrate. Let them sign their names to millions of dollars in predatory loans and buy houses they would never actually own. They had spent 29 years building an empire on a foundation of arrogance and cruelty. I had spent 4 days rewiring that foundation with pure, explosive legal leverage. Friday was coming. The ink on the merger contract was waiting, and the family that had laughed at my desperate need for love was about to find out exactly what happens when you mistake a quiet accountant for a willing victim. Thursday morning arrived with a heavy blanket of gray clouds hanging over the Chicago skyline. The air felt thick and humid. I sat at my desk at the accounting firm. The glowing screens of my dual monitors illuminated my face. I had not slept properly in days. The adrenaline coursing through my veins was the only thing keeping me awake. I had successfully orchestrated the legal capture of my parents' logistics company. The massive $63 million buyout from Apex Global now legally belonged to me. My personal vengeance was perfectly secured, but my professional instincts refused to let me rest. I knew my parents. I knew their boundless greed. I felt a nagging suspicion that I had missed something buried deep in the corporate ledgers. I decided to run one final comprehensive sweep of the company servers. I wanted to ensure the transition would be perfectly clean when I took over on Friday. I navigated past the tax schedules and the asset purchase agreements. I opened a directory specifically dedicated to human resources and payroll. Growing up, the logistics warehouse had been my second home. While my sister Chloe was busy attending cheerleading camps and elite gymnastics academies, I was sitting in the break room of the dispatch center doing my homework. I knew the people who built my parents' empire. I knew William, the head warehouse foreman. William had worked for my father for 25 years. He was a kind man with calloused hands and a loud, booming laugh. When I graduated from high school, my parents did not throw a party, but William handed me a card with a $20 bill tucked inside telling me how proud he was. I knew Helen, the senior dispatcher. She kept a jar of butterscotch candies on her desk and always asked about my math tests. There were 45 employees in total. They were honest, hardworking people who relied on this company to feed their children and pay their mortgages. I opened a subfolder labeled Pre-Acquisition Restructuring. The first document I clicked on was a spreadsheet. It was a master list of all 45 employees. Next to each name was a column detailing their accrued vacation time, their severance eligibility, and the vested balance of their company-matched retirement accounts. The numbers represented decades of sweat and loyalty. I scrolled to the second document. It was a memorandum drafted by a ruthless employment law firm. I read the text, and the breath completely vanished from my lungs. The asset purchase agreement with Apex Global was structured in a very specific way. Apex was acquiring the trucks, the client contracts, and the physical real estate. They were not acquiring the human capital. The agreement stipulated that my parents' company was responsible for terminating the workforce and handling all severance packages before handing over the keys. It is a standard procedure in hostile acquisitions. The expectation is that the seller uses a portion of the massive payout to properly compensate the loyal employees who are losing their jobs. But Sandra and Richard had found a dark, vile loophole. The memorandum outlined a strategy to terminate all 45 employees for manufactured corporate restructuring reasons exactly 12 hours before the Apex Global closing ceremony. By terminating the staff abruptly under these specific fabricated terms, my parents could legally void the corporate obligation to pay out any severance. Even worse, they had structured a clawback provision targeting the company-matched portion of the employee retirement funds. Because the corporate entity was preparing to file for bankruptcy immediately after the sale, my parents planned to sweep all those unvested pension matches back into a protected executive account. They were going to fire William. They were going to fire Helen. They were going to fire 45 working-class families right before a major holiday weekend, stripping them of their health insurance, denying their severance pay, and raiding their retirement funds. I stared at the screen in absolute horror. The total value of the stolen severance and clawed-back pension funds amounted to roughly $2 million. My parents were about to receive a guaranteed cash payout of $63 million from Apex Global. They had absolutely no need for that extra $2 million. They were already richer than kings. But to them, $2 million meant upgraded imported marble for their new Florida mansion. It meant an extra luxury sports car for Brad. It meant another diamond necklace for Chloe. They were perfectly willing to destroy 45 innocent lives just to add a tiny fraction of wealth to their overflowing bank accounts. A profound burning rage erupted inside my chest. It was entirely different from the cold anger I had felt when they stole my own savings. Stealing from me was a personal betrayal. This was an act of pure, unadulterated evil. They were trampling over the very people who had spent their entire lives making my parents wealthy. They viewed William, Helen, and the rest of the staff as nothing more than disposable numbers on a balance sheet, resources to be drained and discarded. My personal battle for justice instantly transformed into a moral crusade. This was no longer just about recovering my $150,000. This was about protecting innocent people from being slaughtered on the altar of my parents' vanity. I picked up my phone and dialed Jonathan Hayes. The corporate lawyer answered immediately. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him to pull up the human resources directory on the secure server link I had provided him. I told him to look at the termination memorandum. I listened to the silence on the other end of the line as Jonathan read the documents. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with disgust. He was a ruthless corporate litigator, but even he had boundaries. He called the strategy utterly repulsive. He confirmed that while the maneuver was technically legal under extremely aggressive corporate restructuring laws, it was morally bankrupt. I asked him if we could stop it. I reminded him that I was now the sole legal owner of the company voting shares. My parents had signed the equity conversion notice blindly. I held the ultimate authority. Jonathan shifted into high gear. He told me the transfer of ownership was mathematically complete, but the state registry had not yet processed the final public filings. However, as the majority shareholder acting with emergency executive authority, I could bind the company to new financial covenants before the Apex Global closing on Friday. We had the power to override my parents' termination plan, but we had to move incredibly fast. I gave him a direct order. I told him we were going to draft a new ironclad corporate resolution. We were going to build an impenetrable fortress around the employees' money. For the next 4 hours, Jonathan and I worked furiously over the phone and through encrypted emails. We were designing a financial shield that Sandra and Richard could not break. Jonathan drafted a binding executive mandate that immediately fully vested every single employee retirement account. There would be no clawbacks. The money belonged to the workers permanently. But I did not stop there. I wanted to make sure my parents' greed cost them dearly. I instructed Jonathan to draft a mandatory unconditional severance package for all 45 employees. I set the terms at 2 full years of salary, plus complete medical coverage for 24 months. I wanted William to be able to retire comfortably. I wanted Helen to have the financial security to care for her family without stressing over a sudden job loss. Jonathan typed furiously, his keyboard clacking loudly over the speakerphone. He asked me how we were going to fund this massive golden parachute for the staff. I smiled at my monitor. I told him we were going to use my parents' money. We inserted a strict, irrevocable payment waterfall into the Apex Global acquisition contract. A payment waterfall dictates exactly how the incoming purchase funds are distributed. I structured the legal language so that the very second the $63 million from Apex Global hit the clearing account on Friday afternoon, the employee severance trust would be funded absolutely first. It was designated as a primary untouchable liability. $5 million would be automatically diverted from the master payout and locked into an independent escrow account managed by Jonathan Law Firm strictly for the benefit of the employees. Sandra and Richard would have absolutely zero access to it. They could not cancel the transfer. They could not dispute it. The money would be gone before they even had a chance to check their bank balances. Jonathan sent me the finalized corporate resolution just before noon. The document was a masterpiece of protective legal architecture. It was beautiful. I opened the PDF file and read through the clauses. Every single worker was guaranteed safety. Their pensions were secured. Their families were protected. The evil, greedy plan my mother had hatched to squeeze a few extra million out of the working class had been entirely neutralized. I clicked the digital signature box. I typed my name. Abigail, sole majority shareholder and chief executive officer. I hit save. The document was sealed. I emailed the finalized resolution back to Jonathan. He confirmed receipt. He told me he would personally register the mandate with the escrow bank handling the Apex Global transaction. The bank would be legally bound to execute my exact distribution orders the moment the ink dried on the acquisition papers tomorrow. I sat back in my chair and let out a long, heavy breath. My hands were shaking slightly, but not from fear. It was the pure, overwhelming rush of taking absolute control. I thought about Sandra standing in her pristine white linen outfit at the church barbecue, boasting about her wonderful family and her righteous prosperity. I thought about Chloe mocking my career, calling me a complacent number cruncher, while she spent millions of dollars on a bridge loan she could never repay. I thought about Richard sitting back and letting his wife steal his daughter's life savings to cover up for a gambling addict. They believed they were the masters of their universe. They believed they could crush anyone who stood in the way of their luxury lifestyle. But they had forgotten the most important rule of the business world. The person who controls the ledger controls the reality. I closed my laptop and packed my briefcase. I had done everything I could do from the shadows. The digital traps were set. The legal bombs were armed. The employee pensions were completely shielded from the impending fallout. There was nothing left to do but wait for the sun to rise on Friday morning. Tomorrow was the closing day. the grand finale. My parents had invited everyone who mattered to the most exclusive country club in the Chicago suburbs to witness their triumph. They had ordered vintage champagne. They had hired premium caterers. They were preparing to put on the performance of a lifetime, a spectacular show of wealth and arrogance designed to elevate them to the highest tier of local society. They were going to get exactly the show they paid for. I walked out of the accounting firm and stepped onto the busy city sidewalk. The gray clouds had finally broken, allowing bright streams of afternoon sunlight to wash over the concrete buildings. I took a deep breath of the fresh air. I felt lighter than I had in 29 years. I was no longer the unloved child. I was no longer the generic accountant. I was the architect of their absolute ruin, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. I walked toward my car, a quiet, dangerous smile playing on my lips. Friday was going to be a masterpiece. The gates of the Heritage Pines Country Club were flanked by towering stone pillars and manicured hedges that looked too green to be natural. It was Friday afternoon, the closing day. The sky over the Chicago suburbs was a brilliant, piercing blue, a stark contrast to the dark storm that had brought me to my parents' living room just over 3 weeks ago. I pulled my reliable 10-year-old sedan past a line of valet attendants who were currently parking a fleet of imported luxury vehicles. I did not hand them my keys. I parked in the far back lot myself, stepping out into the crisp air with my leather portfolio clutched tightly against my side. Inside that portfolio was the court-stamped equity conversion notice and the ironclad employee severance mandate drafted by Jonathan. It was the physical manifestation of my absolute ownership of the logistics company. Walking up the sweeping cobblestone path to the main clubhouse, I could hear the faint, elegant sound of a string quartet spilling out from the open terrace doors. My parents had spared absolutely no expense for this signing ceremony. They had rented the grand ballroom, a cavernous space featuring crystal chandeliers, vaulted ceilings, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the 18th hole of the championship golf course. As I stepped through the double oak doors, the sheer opulence of the event washed over me. Waiters in crisp white jackets glided across the polished hardwood floors, carrying silver trays loaded with caviar blinis and vintage champagne. I scanned the room and immediately spotted my family holding court near the front of the ballroom. They were surrounded by a group of men and women in sharp, dark business suits. The executives from Apex Global. My mother Sandra was laughing loudly at something the lead executive said. She was wearing a custom-tailored emerald gown that draped perfectly across her shoulders, her neck heavy with a new string of South Sea pearls. Beside her stood my sister Chloe, draped in pale pink silk, sporting a diamond tennis bracelet that I knew for a fact had been purchased using the reckless bridge loan Brad had secured earlier that week. Brad was there too, looking incredibly smug in a bespoke Italian suit, swirling a glass of scotch and nodding as if he actually understood the complexities of corporate acquisitions. I took a deep breath, smoothing the lapels of my simple, practical navy blue suit, and began walking toward them. I did not get within 20 feet of the Apex Global executives before Sandra spotted me. Her eyes narrowed instantly, the warm, polite smile she had been directing at the buyers vanishing in a fraction of a second. She excused herself from the conversation with a practiced, graceful gesture, and marched directly toward me, intercepting my path perfectly to ensure the executives could not hear our exchange. Sandra stopped directly in front of me, her gaze sweeping up and down my sensible business attire with undisguised contempt. She asked me what exactly I thought I was doing showing up in a cheap office suit to the most important high society event of her entire life. I kept my voice perfectly level and told her I was here for the closing ceremony just as she had requested when she demanded I organize all the tax schedules. My mother let out a sharp, irritated sigh. She glanced nervously over her shoulder to make sure none of the wealthy country club members were watching us. She leaned in close, the smell of her expensive floral perfume masking the absolute venom in her voice. She told me I did not fit the aesthetic they were trying to project to the Apex Global Board of Directors. She explicitly stated that they needed to present a unified front of effortless generational wealth, and my practical working-class appearance was a jarring embarrassment. She pointed a manicured finger toward the far back corner of the massive ballroom. It was a dark, recessed alcove located directly next to the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. There was a small, unadorned table tucked behind a massive floral arrangement occupied by two exhausted-looking catering managers who were taking a quick break. Sandra told me to go sit over there with the waitstaff. She instructed me to stay completely out of sight and to keep my mouth shut until the final signatures were executed and the bank confirmed the wire transfer. She said once the money was secured, she might let me come up and take a quick family photo if I stood in the back row. I looked at my mother. I looked at the dark corner next to the kitchen, and then I simply nodded. I told her I understood completely. I turned and walked away from the glittering center of the room, making my way through the crowd toward the secluded table. I pulled out a plain wooden chair and sat down next to a young waiter, who was hurriedly polishing silverware. He gave me a sympathetic, questioning look, clearly wondering why a guest had been banished to the employee staging area. I just smiled politely at him and rested my leather portfolio on my lap. Sitting in the shadows, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire ballroom. It was the ultimate vantage point for an auditor. I watched my parents parade around the room, overflowing with arrogant confidence. They truly believed they had won. They had successfully hidden Brad's catastrophic gambling debts. They had manipulated me into emptying my retirement account. They had signed what they thought was a meaningless stack of digital tax forms. And now they were literally minutes away from cashing a check for $63 million. But as I watched them mingle, my eyes searched the crowd for the people who actually built the company. I looked for William, the head warehouse foreman with the calloused hands. I looked for Helen, the senior dispatcher who always kept butterscotch candies on her desk. I scanned the room for any of the 45 loyal employees who had dedicated their lives to making this business profitable. Not a single one of them was there. My parents had banned their own workforce from the celebration. I knew exactly why. According to the malicious corporate restructuring memo I had discovered on their server, Sandra and Richard were planning to formally terminate every single employee at the end of the business day. They were going to steal their vested pensions and deny their severance packages to squeeze a few extra $1 million out of the hollowed-out corporate shell. They did not want the employees present at the country club because it would ruin their celebratory mood to look at the people they were actively destroying. My grip tightened around the leather portfolio. Inside that folder was the binding executive mandate Jonathan and I had drafted, the document that unconditionally secured every single pension and forced a massive 2-year severance payout for the entire staff. My parents thought they were about to steal the workers' retirement funds. They did not know that the money was already legally locked in a protected escrow account, permanently out of their greedy reach. The low hum of conversation in the ballroom suddenly quieted as a sharp, clear chime echoed through the sound system. My father, Richard, had stepped up to the grand mahogany podium positioned at the front of the room. A microphone was clipped to his lapel. The string quartet stopped playing, and the attendees turned their attention to the stage. The Apex Global executives took their seats at the primary VYP table, sitting directly next to Sandra, Chloe, and Brad. Richard cleared his throat and offered the crowd a deeply humble, practiced smile. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and began to speak. He started by thanking the Lord for his boundless grace and for guiding their family through 30 years of trials and tribulations. He spoke with immense passion about the value of hard work, Christian faith, and the unbreakable bonds of family legacy. He painted a picture of a humble man who had built a logistics empire from a single delivery truck, relying on nothing but his own sweat and the unwavering support of his devoted family. It was a masterful performance of complete fiction. He never mentioned the grueling hours his warehouse workers had sacrificed. He never mentioned the sophisticated accounting systems I had built for him entirely for free during my college summers. He only focused on the narrative that served his vanity. Richard turned his gaze toward the VIP table and gestured warmly toward his son-in-law. He told the crowd that the survival and ultimate triumph of the company would not have been possible without Brad. He praised Brad for his aggressive financial intelligence and his bold visionary leadership during the complex acquisition negotiations. He literally credited the gambling addict whose massive federal tax liens had almost derailed the entire buyout for saving the company. Brad nodded solemnly, lifting his crystal flute in acknowledgement, soaking in the applause from the country club members who had absolutely no idea he was drowning in secret debt. Then Richard turned his attention to Chloe. His voice cracked with manufactured emotion as he called her the true heart and soul of the family. He said her constant love and moral support were the foundational pillars that kept him strong during the darkest days of the business. Chloe dabbed at the corner of her eye with a silk napkin, playing the role of the perfect, devoted daughter to absolute perfection. Finally, Richard raised his glass to my mother. He called Sandra his guiding light, the brilliant strategist who always knew exactly what the family needed to survive. He thanked her for her flawless administrative oversight and her unparalleled business acumen. He spoke for nearly 15 minutes. He named his wife, his youngest daughter, his fraudulent son-in-law, and even the family pastor. He listed every single person who he claimed had contributed to the monumental success of the business. He never once mentioned my name. I sat in the dark corner of the ballroom, completely hidden behind a massive arrangement of white orchids, and listened to my father publicly erase my entire existence. I was the one who had drained my life savings and completely emptied my retirement account at midnight to save them from what I thought was imminent foreclosure. I was the one who had spent a week chained to my desk, reconciling their chaotic tax ledgers to appease the apex global auditors. But in the grand, sweeping narrative of the family legacy, I simply was not there. I was completely invisible. They had taken my money, used my professional skills, and then discarded me in the shadows next to the kitchen doors because I did not fit their wealthy aesthetic. The sheer weight of their betrayal should have crushed me. The old version of Abigail, the desperate, pleading daughter who just wanted her parents to be proud of her, would have broken down in tears. She would have run out of the country club devastated by the public humiliation of being completely forgotten. But that version of Abigail was dead. She had died the moment I read the emails mocking my compliance. She had been replaced by the woman currently sitting in the shadows, holding a legally binding contract that granted her absolute ownership of everything in the room. I did not feel sad as the crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause for my father's beautiful speech. I felt an incredible icy calm wash over my entire body. I watched my parents stand up and embrace the apex global executives, their faces glowing with victory. They thought they had successfully crossed the finish line. They thought the game was over. I unzipped my leather portfolio and rested my hand flat against the crisp, heavy paper of the court-stamped equity conversion notice. The rough texture of the state registry seal beneath my fingertips was the most comforting sensation I had ever experienced. The master of ceremonies approached the podium, his voice booming over the speakers to announce that the official signing of the asset purchase agreement was about to commence. The representatives from the escrow bank were making their way to the front of the room, carrying the leather-bound transaction binders that contained the final massive payout. I remained perfectly still in my chair next to the kitchen doors. I did not need to run to the front. I did not need to scream for attention. I just needed to wait for the bankers to review the final chain of title. The trap was fully set, the spring was coiled tight, and my parents were about to step directly onto the trigger. I took a slow sip of my water, keeping my eyes locked on the VIP table, ready to watch their perfect, arrogant world completely shatter into a million pieces. The grand ballroom of the Heritage Pines Country Club was vibrating with a palpable electricity. It was the kind of thick, intoxicating energy that only exists in rooms where massive amounts of money are about to change hands. I sat perfectly still at the small, unadorned wooden table tucked away in the shadowy corner next to the catering kitchen. The scent of roasted tenderloin and truffles drifted through the swinging metal doors beside me, blending with the overwhelming fragrance of expensive floral arrangements. Waiters in crisp white jackets hurried past my chair, completely ignoring my presence. I was exactly where my mother had ordered me to be. I was out of sight, out of mind, and entirely invisible. Across the cavernous room, bathed in the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers, my family was practically vibrating with greed. They were seated at the primary VIP table, positioned directly in front of the sweeping mahogany stage. My father, Richard, was leaning back in his chair with his chest puffed out, accepting handshakes and congratulations from the local country club elite. My mother, Sandra, sat beside him in her custom emerald gown, her posture rigid with practiced aristocratic grace. She kept adjusting the heavy string of pearls around her neck, making sure every photographer in the room captured her perfect angles. Chloe and Brad were huddled together, whispering excitedly, and occasionally glancing down at their phones, no doubt reviewing the interior design catalogs for the $5 million mansion they had just financed, with catastrophic bridge loans. They were so incredibly confident. They had spent the entire week treating me like a disposable servant, forcing me to organize the complex tax schedules that made this exact moment possible. They had mocked my career, insulted my wardrobe, and gleefully anticipated the moment they could file for corporate bankruptcy to wipe away the life savings they had stolen from me. They had also plotted to terminate 45 loyal, hardworking employees, by the end of the day fully intending to steal their vested pensions, to add a few extra million to their offshore accounts. They truly believed they had orchestrated the perfect crime. The low murmur of this crowd began to fade as the string quartet brought their performance to a graceful close. A distinguished gentleman in a tailored charcoal suit stepped up to the podium on the main stage. It was the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Global. He tapped the microphone gently, sending a soft thump echoing through the ballroom. The room fell into an absolute breathless hush. The Apex Chief Executive Officer smiled warmly at the audience. He spoke eloquently about the future of international logistics, the importance of regional supply chains, and the incredible foundation that the acquired company had built over the past 3 decades. He directed his gaze down to the VIP table, offering a respectful nod to Richard and Sandra. He thanked them for their cooperation during the rigorous auditing process and praised the exceptional condition of their financial disclosures. I took a slow sip of my iced water in the dark corner. I knew exactly why those financial disclosures were in such exceptional condition. I had spent 60 hours making sure they were flawless, wrapping my lethal trap in the absolute perfection of my accounting work. And now the executives announced, his voice booming over the speakers. "We are thrilled to officially finalize this acquisition. To execute the final transfer of funds, I would like to invite our Chief Escrow Officer and the managing representatives from our partner bank to the stage." A side door near the front of the ballroom opened. 3 men in immaculate dark suits walked briskly onto the stage. 2 of the men were carrying an enormous, oversized ceremonial check. The amount printed in bold black ink across the front was staggering. $63 million. The crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause. Camera flashes popped like strobe lights, illuminating the ballroom in brilliant bursts of white. At the VIP table, Richard and Sandra immediately stood up. They were beaming, their faces flushed with the ultimate triumph of their boundless greed. Richard buttoned his suit jacket, preparing to walk onto the stage and accept the massive fortune. Chloe was clapping wildly, bouncing on her heels, while Brad raised his glass of scotch in a victorious salute. But the Chief Escrow Officer did not smile. He did not look at my parents. He stepped up to the podium, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, and placed a thick, leather-bound folder onto the wooden surface. He raised his hand, signaling for the applause to cease. The clapping slowly died down, replaced by a confused, restless silence. Richard paused at the edge of the VIP table, his smile faltering slightly as he waited for his cue to approach the stage. The escrow officer leaned into the microphone. His voice was clinical, devoid of any celebratory warmth. It was the precise, detached tone of a man whose only loyalty was to the strict parameters of corporate law. Before we proceed with the ceremonial handover, the escrow officer stated clearly, "I must address a critical update regarding the finalized chain of title for this transaction." A ripple of nervous murmurs swept through the ballroom. At the VIP table, Sandra frowned, glancing sharply at Richard. Richard shrugged slightly, looking annoyed by the bureaucratic delay. They clearly assumed this was just a minor legal formality, a final piece of tedious red tape before they could get their hands on the money. The escrow officer opened his leather folder. "As the legally designated fiduciary for this acquisition, our institution is required to disperse the purchase funds strictly to the verified legal owners of the corporate entity, as of the precise moment of closing." He looked up from his documents, his gaze sweeping across the quiet room. "At 9 o'clock this morning, our legal department received and verified a fully executed notice of equity conversion, properly filed and registered with the State Commerce Commission." I sat perfectly still in my chair by the kitchen doors. I could hear my own heartbeat thumping steadily in my ears. This conversion was legally triggered by a default on an institutional promissory note. The escrow officer continued, his voice ringing out with devastating clarity. Furthermore, the conversion was explicitly authorized and electronically signed by the current chief executive officer, the corporate secretary, and a member of the board of directors just 5 days ago. At the VIP table, Richard's face went completely blank. Sandra gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. They had absolutely no idea what the man on the stage was talking about. They had clicked through that massive digital document without reading a single page, entirely blinded by their rush to get to the closing ceremony. They did not realize that their own lazy, arrogant signatures had legally sealed their doom. The escrow officer took a breath, delivering the final fatal blow. Therefore, according to the latest changes in legal structure and ownership records confirmed by the state court, this money belongs to the company's sole controlling shareholder. Richard let out a nervous, breathless laugh. He stepped forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Now hold on a minute," Richard called out, his voice echoing awkwardly in the massive room. "There must be some kind of administrative mistake. My wife and I are the majority owners. We are right here. Just bring the check down to this table." The escrow officer did not respond. He simply stepped back from the podium and nodded to the two men holding the enormous ceremonial check. The men carrying the $63 million check walked down the short flight of stairs from the stage. They stepped onto the polished hardwood floor and began walking directly toward the VIP table. Richard smiled again, letting out a heavy sigh of relief, reaching his hands out to grasp the edge of the glossy cardboard. Sandra stood right beside him, her emerald gown shimmering under the chandeliers, ready for her photograph. But the bank representatives did not stop. They walked right past Richard's outstretched hands. They walked right past Sandra's perfect frozen smile. They walked right past Chloe and Brad. The entire ballroom descended into a state of absolute suffocating paralysis. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Hundreds of wealthy country club guests watched in utter bewilderment as the bank executives carrying the massive fortune completely ignored the family of honor and continued marching down the center aisle of the room. They walked past the tables of bewildered investors. They walked past the whispering country club elders. They headed straight toward the dark recessed alcove at the very back of the ballroom. They headed straight toward the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. I stood up from my plain wooden chair. I smoothed the lapels of my sensible working-class navy suit. I picked up my leather portfolio and stepped out from behind the massive floral arrangement. The bank representative stopped directly in front of me. The escrow officer who had followed them across the room offered me a deep, respectful nod. "Miss Abigail Myers," the escrow officer said, his voice entirely professional. "As the sole verified legal owner of 100% of the voting shares, we present you with the finalized acquisition funds. Additionally, as per your executive mandate, the $5 million employee severance and pension protection trust has been fully funded and locked into escrow." He handed me a heavy envelope containing the certified bank wire confirmations. The two assistants carefully positioned the massive $63 million ceremonial check right in front of me. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, crushing silence that follows a catastrophic explosion. Every single head in the room was turned toward the back corner. Hundreds of eyes stared at the daughter who had been banished to the shadows, who was now holding the entire financial legacy of the family in her hands. Then the silence shattered. It started with a sound I will never forget. It was a visceral, ear-piercing shriek that ripped through the elegant atmosphere of the country club. Chloe had leaped up from her chair, her face contorted in absolute unhinged terror. "No!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking hysterically. "No. That is our money. That is my house. You cannot do this. You are just the accountant." Brad stumbled backward, crashing into a chair and knocking it over. His face had drained of all color, turning the sickly pale hue of old parchment. The realization of what had just happened was crashing down on him with the weight of a freight train. He had just signed personal guarantees for millions of dollars in predatory bridge loans. He had purchased a $5 million mansion and ordered custom Italian furniture based entirely on a corporate payout that now legally belonged to me. He was not just broke. He was buried under a mountain of immediate high-interest debt that would completely destroy him. But the most spectacular reaction came from the woman who had orchestrated my misery from the very beginning. Sandra stood perfectly still at the VIP table. She was staring at me across the vast expanse of the ballroom. I met her eyes, my expression completely neutral, offering absolutely no sympathy, no anger, and no gloating. I simply looked at her as the sole owner of her former empire. The reality of the trap closed around her. She remembered the massive DocuSign packet she had carelessly clicked through while drinking wine at a tasting event. She remembered the generic promissory note she had printed from the internet to steal my life savings. She realized that her own blinding arrogance had given me the exact weapon I needed to tear her world apart. Her fingers went entirely slack. The delicate crystal champagne glass she had been holding slipped from her grasp. It hit the polished hardwood floor, shattering into dozens of sharp, glittering pieces that scattered across the room. The sharp crash echoed like a gunshot. Sandra began to tremble. Her entire body shook violently. She reached out with a trembling hand and clutched the back of her heavy dining chair, her knuckles white, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She stared at the shattered glass at her feet, then looked back at me, her eyes wide with total devastation. "We are ruined," Sandra whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but in the dead silence of the ballroom, the words carried perfectly. "We are completely ruined." Richard staggered back, clutching his chest. He looked between the Apex Global executives on the stage and his daughter standing in the back corner with the money. He tried to speak, tried to formulate some kind of command or threat, but his authority was entirely gone. He was a king without a kingdom, a tyrant who had just been legally evicted from his own castle. I did not offer them a single word of comfort. I did not walk over to explain the mechanics of the venture capital conversion clause. I simply stood by the kitchen doors, holding the heavy envelope that secured the futures of 45 innocent employees. I had saved William's retirement. I had protected Helen's severance package. The $2 million my parents had planned to steal from the working-class staff was now safely locked away in an untouchable trust, completely shielded from my family's greed. The people who had actually built the logistics network would be rewarded for their decades of loyalty, while the people who had tried to discard them were left holding nothing but the ashes of their own vanity. The Apex Global executives on the stage quickly realized that they had just stepped into the middle of a catastrophic family war. They swiftly gathered their briefcases and began conferring in hushed, urgent tones with their legal counsel, determined to distance their massive corporation from the toxic meltdown happening at the VIP table. The country club guests were whispering frantically, pulling out their phones, documenting the spectacular public destruction of the Myers family facade. I handed the massive ceremonial check back to one of the bank assistants. I did not need a cardboard prop to know what I had accomplished. I tucked the certified wire confirmations safely into my leather portfolio and turned toward the exit. I walked out of the grand ballroom, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. I did not look back at the chaos. I did not look back at Chloe sobbing uncontrollably into her silk dress, or Brad staring blankly at the wall, or Sandra gripping the chair like a woman standing on the edge of a cliff. I stepped out of the country club and into the bright, crisp afternoon sunlight. The air felt incredibly clean. I walked across the manicured lawn, bypassed the busy valet stand, and made my way back to my practical, reliable 10-year-old sedan. I unlocked the door, sat in the driver's seat, and placed the leather portfolio on the passenger side. I rested my hands on the steering wheel and looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I was 29 years old. I was no longer the obedient, overlooked daughter desperate for a scrap of validation. I was a completely free woman. My parents had taught me a brutal lesson about the true nature of love and leverage. They had shown me that blood does not guarantee loyalty, and that some people will happily sacrifice their own children to protect their pride. But I had taught them a lesson of my own. I had taught them that when you force a brilliant accountant into a corner, she will not cry. She will simply rewrite the ledger. I started the engine of my car. I pulled out of the country club parking lot and drove down the winding tree-lined road, leaving my family behind to face the magnificent, unpayable debts they had built for themselves. I drove toward the city, toward my future. Knowing that my life savings were fully recovered, the innocent employees were completely protected, and the grand greedy empire of Richard and Sandra Myers had been legally, permanently, and spectacularly burned to the ground. If you are watching this and you have ever felt like the disposable, invisible member of your own family, if you have ever been manipulated, used, and discarded by the people who were supposed to protect you, I want you to know something incredibly important. You do not have to accept the role they assigned to you. You do not have to shrink yourself to fit into their narrative. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop seeking their approval and start looking closely at the documents they ask you to sign. Set your boundaries. Build your own security. And never let anyone convince you that your practical, quiet competence is a weakness. If this story resonated with you, If you found satisfaction in watching arrogance face the ultimate legal consequence, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. I would love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to outsmart a toxic family member? Tell me your story in the comments, and let me know where in the world you are watching from right now. Until next time, always remember to read the fine print, and never be afraid to take back what is rightfully yours. The suffocating silence in the grand ballroom hung in the air for only a few fleeting seconds before it violently shattered. The illusion of my family's untouchable dynasty broke right alongside it. My father, Richard, was the first to react. The initial wave of paralyzing shock that had frozen him to the polished hardwood floor rapidly mutated into an ugly, volatile fury. His face turned a deep, mottled shade of crimson. He pushed away from the VIP table, his chair scraping loudly against the floorboards, and began marching down the center aisle of the room. He completely ignored the stares of the wealthy country club patrons, his eyes locked entirely on the massive ceremonial check resting on the table in front of me. He moved with the aggressive, entitled swagger of a man who believed the entire world existed simply to serve his demands. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my face as he closed the distance between us. "Give that back right now," Richard bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers. "I do not know what kind of pathetic, desperate stunt you think you are pulling, Abigail, but that money belongs to my company. You are going to hand over that check, and then you are going to get out of my sight before I have security throw you onto the street." I did not flinch. I did not shrink back into my chair. I simply looked at him, completely unbothered by his booming voice and aggressive posture. Before I could even open my mouth to respond, a tall, impeccably dressed figure stepped out from the shadows behind my table, smoothly inserting himself directly between my father and me. It was Jonathan Hayes. My brilliant, utterly ruthless corporate attorney had been standing quietly by the kitchen doors the entire time, waiting for exactly this moment. Jonathan held up a single manicured hand, stopping my father in his tracks. He spoke in a tone that was remarkably quiet, yet it carried the sharp, dangerous edge of a scalpel. "I am afraid you are profoundly mistaken, Richard," Jonathan said smoothly. "That money does not belong to your company because you no longer possess a company." Richard stopped, his chest heaving. He looked at Jonathan with a mixture of confusion and boiling rage. He demanded to know who Jonathan was, and threatened to sue him for corporate espionage. He claimed he was the chief executive officer of the logistics firm, and that no one could authorize a transfer of ownership without his explicit written consent. Jonathan offered a slow, predatory smile. He unclasped the leather briefcase he was carrying and pulled out a thick stack of printed documents. He placed them on the table, right next to the $63 million check. "Actually, Richard, you provided your explicit written consent exactly 5 days ago," Jonathan explained, tapping the top page of the stack. "You, your wife Sandra, and your daughter Chloe all provided certified electronic signatures on a document titled Auxiliary Schedule C Shareholder Equity Realignment and Unsecured Debt Capitalization Consent. It was included in the digital tax packet you were so desperately rushing to complete before this afternoon." Sandra had followed Richard down the aisle. She stood a few feet behind him, her emerald gown suddenly looking like a tragic costume. Her face was chalk white, her mouth hung open in absolute disbelief as she stared at the documents on the table. Jonathan turned his piercing gaze toward my mother. He asked her if she remembered rushing through a 400-page digital document while attending a wine tasting event on Saturday. He asked her if she remembered ignoring the fine print because she viewed administrative reading as a tedious chore meant for people she considered beneath her. "You forced your daughter to sign a predatory venture capital-grade promissory note to steal her life savings." Jonathan continued, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "You thought you could use a fake bankruptcy to wipe out her money. But you were too arrogant to read the contract you provided. It contained a mandatory financial disclosure clause. When you deliberately hid this $63 million acquisition from her, you triggered a technical default. That default activated a unilateral debt conversion right." Jonathan picked up the final page of the document and held it up so my parents could see their own digital signatures perfectly stamped at the bottom. By signing this electronic document without reading it, Jonathan declared, his voice ringing with absolute legal finality, "You legally surrendered 100% of your voting shares to Abigail. She is the sole owner. She is the chief executive officer. And she is the only person walking out of this building with that money today." The color completely drained from Richard's face. The aggressive, booming tyrant vanished, replaced by a hollow, terrified old man. He looked at the document, then looked back at me, his eyes wide with a sudden, crushing comprehension. He realized that his own blinding laziness had handed me the exact weapon I needed to tear his empire to the ground. Behind them, the lead executive from Apex Global stepped forward. He had left the VIP table and walked down the aisle accompanied by his own legal team. His expression was a mask of cold, professional disgust. Richard turned to the executive, a look of pure desperation washing over his features. He held up his hands, begging the man to listen, promising that this was just a temporary family misunderstanding that his lawyers would fix by Monday morning. He pleaded with the executive to freeze the escrow account and halt the transaction until the courts could sort it out. The Apex Global executive did not even look at my father. He looked directly past him, focusing his attention entirely on me. Apex Global conducts incredibly thorough due diligence, the executive stated, his voice loud enough for the entire country club to hear. We were notified of the legal ownership transfer by the state registry this morning. We have reviewed the conversion documents, and our legal department has confirmed they are absolutely ironclad. He then turned his cold gaze toward Richard and Sandra. He told them that Apex Global prides itself on operating with integrity and transparency. He said his board of directors had absolutely no interest in doing business with executives who engage in predatory financial manipulation against their own family members. He called their behavior repulsive and explicitly referred to them as imposters, sitting at a table they no longer owned. We are finalizing this acquisition with the true legal owner of the company, the executive concluded, offering me a respectful nod. The rest of you are trespassing on our time. Sandra let out a soft, horrifying whimper. She grabbed the edge of a nearby chair, her body trembling violently as the sheer magnitude of her ruin finally crushed the breath from her lungs. She whispered the word ruined over and over again, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the whispering crowd. The immediate fallout was spectacular, brutal, and entirely deserved. Chloe and Brad had spent the last week acting like untouchable royalty. They had flaunted their impending wealth, mocking my career, and purchasing a $5 million mansion with a high-interest bridge loan. The moment the news of the ownership transfer broke, their financial house of cards instantly vaporized. The private lenders who had issued the bridge loan required proof of incoming capital by Monday morning. When Brad could not produce the funds from the logistics company buyout, the lenders called the massive note entirely due. Chloe and Brad had absolutely zero liquid cash to cover the millions of dollars they had borrowed. Within 48 hours, the bank initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings on their new estate. The custom Italian furniture they had ordered was canceled. The luxury vehicles they had leased were quickly repossessed from the cobblestone driveway. Brad's massive hidden tax liabilities were fully exposed to his new creditors, dragging both of them into a catastrophic personal bankruptcy that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Chloe's arrogant smirks were replaced by endless hysterical crying as she was forced to pack her designer clothes into cardboard boxes. My parents fared no better. They had hollowed out their own original company, planning to dump it into bankruptcy to avoid paying me back. Now they were left with absolutely nothing. The $63 million payout from Apex Global was securely resting in my private accounts. Richard and Sandra were suddenly burdened with their own massive personal debts, expensive country club dues, and the maintenance costs of a lifestyle they could no longer afford. The social exile was even more painful for them than the financial ruin. The country club community thrives on appearances and pristine reputations. The spectacle in the grand ballroom had exposed them as manipulative frauds who tried to steal from their own daughter to cover up a gambling addiction. The church elders stopped returning their calls. The affluent neighbors who had praised Sandra at the barbecue suddenly found themselves too busy to attend her dinner parties. The board of directors at the country club quietly but firmly requested that Richard and Sandra resign their membership to avoid further public embarrassment. They were driven out of the high society circle they had sacrificed my future to impress. While their world burned to the ground, I focused entirely on building something better. The very first thing I did on Monday morning, sitting in my new spacious office as the recognized leader of the transition team, was execute the employee protection mandate. I asked William, the head warehouse foreman, and Helen, the senior dispatcher, to come into my office. They walked in looking nervous, holding their worn hard hats and clipboards, fully expecting the new corporate owners to lay them off. I did not sit behind the large desk. I walked over and sat at the small conference table with them. I handed them each a heavy court-certified portfolio. I told them that the company had been successfully acquired by Apex Global, but before the keys were handed over, I had made sure the ledger was perfectly balanced. I watched William open his folder. His rough, calloused hands began to shake as he read the financial summary. I had legally secured a permanent, fully funded retirement trust for all 45 employees. Every single penny of their company matched pensions was permanently vested and safely locked away from any corporate interference. Furthermore, I explained that because the acquisition required a workforce transition, every employee was receiving an unconditional severance package equal to 2 full years of their current salary, plus 24 months of comprehensive medical coverage. Helen covered her mouth with her hands, tears spilling over her cheeks and dropping onto the crisp white paper. William looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound gratitude. He tried to speak, tried to find the words to thank me for saving his family's future, but his voice completely failed him. I just smiled, reached across the table, and squeezed his hand. I told him he had spent 25 years building this company, and it was finally time for the company to take care of him. Securing the safety of those 45 loyal workers brought me a level of deep, resonant joy that no amount of personal wealth ever could. My parents had viewed those people as disposable numbers to be erased for a larger profit margin. I viewed them as the very soul of the enterprise. Using the buyout money to protect the innocent was the absolute ultimate victory. It proved that I had not just defeated my family, I had refused to become them. The transition with Apex Global took several weeks to fully complete. I worked closely with their executive team, ensuring the physical assets were transferred smoothly and the client contracts were perfectly integrated. They offered me a highly lucrative position on their regional advisory board, recognizing the forensic accounting skills that had allowed me to execute the shadow takeover. I politely declined. I had enough money to secure my future for 10 lifetimes, and I had absolutely no desire to spend another minute dealing with corporate logistics. On my final day in the office, I packed my personal belongings into a single cardboard box. I did not take any souvenirs from the company my parents had built. I did not need any reminders of the past. I walked out of the glass doors of the corporate headquarters and stepped into the warm, bright afternoon sunlight. I walked to my car, placed the box in the trunk, and looked back at the building one last time. For 29 years, I had desperately tried to earn a place inside that world. I had let my parents diminish my accomplishments. I had let my sister mock my practical nature. I had allowed them to convince me that my quiet loyalty was a weakness to be exploited, but I had finally learned the truth. My quiet nature was not a weakness. It was the absolute patience required to build an inescapable trap. I started the engine and drove away, leaving the greed, the manipulation, and the toxic legacy of Richard and Sandra Myers in the rearview mirror. I was driving toward a life of complete freedom and absolute financial independence. I was going to travel. I was going to start a philanthropic foundation. I was going to live entirely on my own terms, surrounded only by people who truly valued my presence. Kindness without boundaries is a knife in the hands of evil, even if it is your own flesh and blood. You can spend your entire life trying to buy the love of people who view you as nothing more than a resource, or you can draw a hard line and protect your own future. If you have ever been exploited for your trust and your money by your own family, be brave and stand up. You do not have to accept the role of the victim. Leave a comment and let me know. What would you do if you were in my situation? Would you have warned them about the trap? Or would you have let them sign their own financial death warrant? Do not forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and comment where and when you are watching this video. Your voice could save someone who is struggling out there right now. Thank you for listening, and remember to always read the fine print.